In the middle of Ridgewood Hollow's bustling summer fair, a silent 9-year-old girl walks into an auction carrying nothing but a worn backpack and a jar of coins, the last trace of her mother, who died in a mysterious explosion. On the stage lies Tara, a once legendary German shepherd, now caged and forgotten. But when their eyes meet, something shifts. The crowd goes quiet, and a truth buried for months begins to surface. What made this dog growl in the middle of a council hearing? And why did an entire town choose to stand with a child who hadn't spoken a single word? Ridgewood Hollow, on a midsummer day, blazing with sunlight, tangled in voices. The annual fair had returned, bringing with it everything that made this small town feel alive each summer. The clanking bells of a rusted roller coaster, loudspeakers blaring caramel apples and roasted corn, and bursts of laughter cracking open under the scorching sun, as if everyone was trying to drown out the weight in the air. A heavy mix of dry hay, melting asphalt, and unspoken grief. People spoke loudly, as if silence might allow sorrow to crawl out from between the cracks in the pavement. Only one person said nothing. Mira Collins, 9 years old, small and slight like a shadow, walked quietly through the fair gates, slipping between the cheerful crowd. She walked alone. No one noticed. No one saw that this little girl hadn't spoken a single word since the day her mother vanished into the flames, back in March. Just 3 months ago, an explosion had ripped through the chemical warehouse on the south edge of town. People called it an accident, a technical fault. But Mira knew better. She remembered that final morning, when her mother, Inspector Eliza Collins, stood in the doorway, dressed in uniform, smiled, and gently smoothed Mira's hair. "Just one night, sweetheart. I'll be home before you know it." But Eliza never came home. The sheriff showed up. So did the fire crews and the local press. Some said it was a gas leak. Others whispered that Eliza had found something she was never meant to see. No explanation felt right. And since that day, Mira had gone silent. Not because she didn't want to speak, but because she couldn't. Something inside her chest clamped down each time she tried to open her mouth, as if her voice had been buried along with the flag-draped coffin she couldn't bring herself to approach during that cold, rainy funeral. When the loudspeaker echoed across the grounds, announcing the start of the K9 auction, Mira clutched the small backpack on her shoulders. Inside was a glass jar, its lid rusting slightly. In that jar was $58 and some coins, all the money Mira had ever saved. Birthday bills, supermarket change, coins rolled under her bed, and the crumpled ones her mother used to secretly tuck into her coat pocket on early mornings. The jar was wrapped tightly in an old towel. The fabric still held the faint scent of her mother's shampoo. No one knew how long Mira had planned this. No one saw her rise at 4 a.m., dress herself, make a cold cup of cocoa, and sit quietly, waiting for the first sunlight to hit the window. The car ride to the fair was silent. Rachel, her gentle, grief-stricken stepmother, kept glancing at Mira through the rearview mirror, as if searching for words she no longer had. Neil, the man Mira had called Uncle for the past year, gripped the wheel tightly, like he was holding on to something that was slowly slipping away. They dropped her off in a gravel lot behind the livestock pens. Mira didn't wait for anyone to speak. She stepped out, backpack strapped on, eyes fixed on the main tent, where a crooked wooden sign read, "Retired Police K9 Auction. Only one dog today." The townspeople had already packed inside. Some came out of curiosity, others for the reputation of the dog on the block, Tara, the legendary German shepherd who had served in some of Ridgewood Hollow's most high-profile cases. And only Mira came for something else, for something deeper. She slipped through the crowd, The smell of sweat, apple syrup, and sun-baked iron from the corral bars filled the tent. People chatted, laughed, pointed. A plump woman jabbed a finger toward the crate in the center of the arena. "That's her, Colin's dog. Still looks strong, doesn't she?" Tara lay motionless inside the cage. Her coat was dark, her eyes a deep golden ash. She wasn't resting. She was watching, guarding, not because anyone was a threat, but because she was still on duty, still loyal to Eliza, even if Eliza was gone. Mira stopped a few steps from the cage. No one noticed the shift in Tara's gaze, how her eyes moved away from the crowd and locked onto Mira, and never looked away again. Inside Mira, memories began to surface. She remembered the nights when her mother and Tara came home after long shifts. The way Eliza would call out, "Tara, sit!" The way Tara circled Mira's bed whenever she was sick. The night before the explosion, Eliza sitting at the kitchen table, typing, gently stroking Tara's ear, whispering, "If anything happens, you know what to do, right?" Mira never understood those words. Until now. Standing before the iron bars, she understood why this dog still looked at her that way, like a promise unfulfilled. Why every breath she took felt so heavy, because her heart was speaking in her mother's voice. Why she had to do everything, even give up every dollar she had, to bring Tara home. Not because she was lonely, not because Tara had once belonged to her mother, but because in Tara's eyes, Mira saw the last remaining truth of the mission her mother had died for. The wooden floor creaked beneath shifting feet. A sharp scent of damp hay and rusted iron lingered in the air. Beside a modest sign that read, "K9 retired, Tara, 6 years of service," stood a solitary cage, so stark, so stripped of spectacle, it felt like it belonged to a different world from the colorful chaos of the fair just outside. Tara lay still inside. A coiled mass of disciplined muscle, she rested with the precision of a sculpted statue. The pose was textbook, straight from the training manual, but no one had ever taught her how to command presence like that. It was the instinct of a creature once trusted to step where even men hesitated. Her coat was a charcoal gray, flecked like cooled ash after a fire. A long, hook-shaped scar slashed across her left shoulder. No one quite knew where it came from, only that the last time Eliza came home with dried blood on her collar, she'd washed her hands for a long, long time in silence while Tara lay beneath her feet, breathing slow, golden eyes staring into the shadows. They say dogs don't remember. But if any living thing could defy that claim with just a gaze, it was Tara. Her eyes weren't sad. They weren't angry. They held something deeper, a timeless patience, as if she had been waiting here a long time and would go on waiting until something was fulfilled. The moment those eyes met Mira's at the auction, they didn't blink. They didn't shift. They didn't question. They simply looked, as if Tara already knew. Mira stepped forward, slowly. Her small hands tightened around the glass jar hidden in her backpack. She stopped about 6 feet from the cage. Tara's eyes never left hers. No one in that auction hall knew. This wasn't the first time these two survivors had met. A month earlier, on a quiet night in mid-April, when Ridgewood Hollow still ached with grief, Mira had crept from her bed. Wearing her mother's old navy-purple coat, she slipped out the back trail behind the house and crossed the overgrown garden. The moon wasn't full, but it was bright enough to show the way. Behind the old police outpost, beyond the chain-link fence that separated the building from an empty field, Tara had been chained, confined to a makeshift kennel. The new police chief had refused to take her to the updated station. "Too old, too stubborn, can't be retrained," they said. Mira hadn't listened. Each night when Rachel believed she was asleep, Mira would sneak out to that fence. She'd sit cross-legged near Tara's pen, arms hugging her knees, whispering into the night. "I know you miss her?" Mira never spoke out loud, but the words were vivid in her mind. "I do too. I don't know where she went." "Did you see her that night?" "I can't talk. They think I'm okay, but I'm not, Tara." Tara never reacted strongly. She would simply lift her head, move closer, press her nose to the fence. And each time, Mira would reach out, fingertips brushing the cold steel, trying to close the space between two souls strangled by the adult world's silence. There were no replies, but none were needed. Mira didn't know why she turned to a dog instead of the people in her home. But Tara's silence wasn't frightening. Her quiet, steady presence, like a slow breath in a storm, was the only thing holding Mira together. She sat by that fence night after night. No one noticed. No one knew. But from that night on, Tara began to change. She stopped turning away when Mira came near. She refused to eat unless Mira was nearby. She no longer barked at strangers, only observed quietly, as if sniffing for a truth only she could sense. And from that night on, Mira changed too. She began collecting coins scattered around the house, checked under pillows, dug through old drawers. Each coin dropped into that glass jar brought her closer to the one thing she thought she could still do: bring Tara home. The auction was about to begin. The MC adjusted his microphone, smiling with a mouth that didn't quite reach his eyes. Rachel stood back near a wooden post, red-eyed and silent. Neil stared into his phone, pretending to be busy. Mira didn't move. She unzipped her backpack, pulled out the glass jar, and set it on the wooden floor. The soft clink of metal against glass was faint, but clear. Tara's ears twitched. Her eyes followed every movement. And when the MC began his pitch, this brave dog served 6 years with the Ridgewood PD. She helped solve 12 major cases, once nearly gave her life charging into a burning building to search for a missing person. No one noticed that Tara's eyes never left Mira. She didn't look at the crowd, didn't look at the bidders, ready to throw down thousands for a noble-looking pet. She looked only at the silent little girl, the only one carrying something that still tethered her to this world: Eliza's memory. At that moment, if anyone had dared ask, "Does this dog still have value?" they wouldn't need an expert's answer. They'd only need to look into those eyes that spoke a story of loss, grief, and waiting, yet never once gave in to despair. And in the quiet space between girl and dog, between heartbreak and hope, between the death of a mother and an unspoken promise, there stood only two beings who understood each other through silence: a girl who could no longer speak, and a dog who refused to forget. The third bell rang, a slow, hollow chime, signaling the auction was about to begin. Inside the faded green tarp tent, Mira sat curled up on an old wooden bench, clutching her backpack, as if holding on to something that kept her alive. Just a few steps behind, Rachel stood silently, eyes locked on the little girl, as if the moment she looked away, Mira might vanish. Like Eliza once had. Rachel Collins hadn't given birth to Mira, but in those quiet, broken moments, when a small hand reached for hers, when a whisper echoed in the rain, "Ms. Rachel, will Mom come back?" She knew love didn't need blood. One look, one fragile hand, one question asked beneath a thunderstorm. That was enough to tether her life to this child's. She loved Mira. Truly. But love, like a window stuck after a storm, couldn't open the door Mira had shut tight the day her mother died. Since the moment Eliza was laid beneath the cold ground, Mira hadn't spoken. Rachel had tried everything: therapy sessions, library visits, art classes, a stuffed bunny from the shop window Mira once lingered at, even a whole new bedroom painted in purple, Eliza's favorite color. But it always ended the same, a quiet shake of the head. Dry, distant eyes that looked straight through every effort. Rachel didn't blame Mira. She blamed herself. Blamed herself for not being there that night. For trusting Neil when he said, "It's just a routine check. She'll be back." Blamed the looks people gave her in Ridgewood Hollow, the look they gave a woman caught between two roles, stepmother to a grieving child, and widow to a name no one wanted to say aloud. Neil, on the other hand, didn't drown in guilt. He met grief with bone-cold logic. We have to move on. Mira needs stability. She can't stay silent forever. He didn't cry at the funeral, didn't speak of sorrow. He just stared at the gravestone, then made a call to Eliza's lawyer about estate procedures. Since that day, an invisible wall stood between him and Mira. Not out of hatred, but because they spoke different languages. He spoke in reason. She, in silence. Outside the auction tent, a truck bearing the Vale Industries logo pulled up to the curb. Few noticed. It was a familiar vehicle, belonging to the most powerful man in the county, Conrad Vale. He didn't like noise, didn't need to speak much, but his name made police chiefs put down phones, made mayors bow their heads at galas, and made investigations vanish with a single anonymous email. Vale came from old money. His family once owned the chemical plant that had exploded in a blazing inferno months ago. Since then, he'd donated generously, rebuilt the local school, sponsored the fire department, funded the nursing home. People called him the Golden Philanthropist. Only Eliza had ever written otherwise. In a short, unsent note left for Rachel, she had warned, "Don't trust him. Poison always wears the prettiest shell." Vale didn't come to the fairgrounds today, but a man in a gray suit did. Earpiece in one ear, stiff posture. He stepped out of the truck, eyes scanning the tent until they landed, without hesitation, on Tara and on the girl she wouldn't stop watching. Then he stepped back, made a call. And in that moment, an invisible door creaked open. Neil arrived late. He found Rachel sitting on the wooden steps, eyes red. He sighed, closed his phone, and approached, solid frame, heavy steps like someone late for a meeting. "You let her near that dog again?" he asked, half scolding, half tired. "She went on her own. I couldn't stop her," Rachel replied softly. "Then try harder," Neil snapped. "She needs to move on. A dog won't bring her mother back." Rachel turned, eyes brimming. "You really think Tara is just a dog?" Neil paused. His voice softened. I don't want Mira stuck in the past. You know this. Grief can't raise a child." Rachel looked away, then said, "But pretending there's no grief? That'll destroy her faster." Her words sliced through the fragile air like a quiet blade. Inside the tent, Mira hadn't moved. Her gaze never wavered. She knew Neil didn't hate her, but she also knew he didn't understand. In the world of grown-ups, people tried to turn tragedy into a life lesson, but for a child, sometimes all they needed was someone who stayed, no explanations required. Right now, only Tara knew how to do that. Outside, more people had begun to gather for the auction. Mira didn't look at them, but from across the fence, she saw the man in the gray suit. And his eyes, the cold, calculating kind, looked just like those of the people who took her mother away. Rachel noticed, but said nothing. Neil noticed, and turned away. Only Mira held still, her arms wrapped around the glass jar, her eyes locked on Tara. In that moment, though no one knew it yet, this wasn't just an auction. It was the beginning of a battle, not to own a dog, but to reclaim the last piece of justice still left standing. The air inside the tent was thick as chalk dust. The mingled scents of sweat, scorched popcorn, rotting wood, and dog musk formed a dense, choking haze. The crowd packed both wooden rows, their murmurs fluttering through the heat. But Mira heard none of it. In her world, there were only two things left: the glass jar in her hands and Tara's gaze through the bars. That jar, holding $58.11, was heavy with every coin Mira had saved over the past 3 years. Birthday bills, pocket change from Rachel, cookie sales, even a crumpled $5 bill she once found outside the supermarket. Each cent carried a fragile wish that maybe, one day, someone would come back. And today, Mira had come to reclaim what was left of her mother. The MC took the stage, his smile polished, his eyes empty. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us at this special auction today. And our main attraction, he swept a hand toward the large iron cage at the corner of the platform. None other than Tara, the legendary K9 of Ridgewood Hollow PD. Scattered applause rippled through the room. Polite, curious. Some didn't know why they came. Some remembered the cases Tara had helped solve. Some just wanted a good-looking dog. But one person had come for something else. Conrad Vale wasn't in the room, but his man was. The one in the gray suit, with the Bluetooth in his ear. He sat in the front row, arms crossed, his gaze cold as November wind. And from the back of the tent, Mira stepped forward. She wove through the benches, her worn sneakers barely making a sound. The glass jar clinked softly with every step. She stopped a few feet from the cage. Tara sat perfectly still, stone-like, but her ears twitched. Then her head tilted toward Mira, and their eyes met. In that moment, everything else dissolved. Light slanted through the faded green tarp above, casting a soft beam on the child below. Tara didn't blink. She stared like she'd waited a lifetime for this single moment. Mira unzipped her backpack, pulled out the jar, didn't speak, just raised it high, arms trembling slightly, and held it out toward the MC. The man blinked, then offered a stiff, patronizing smile. "Well now, little one, are you bidding?" Mira nodded. She stepped forward. The crowd murmured. "And how much would you like to offer?" Mira opened the jar, poured the contents into her palm, counted every bill, every coin. $58.11, Rachel said quietly from the back, her voice cracking. A laugh burst from the crowd, short, bitter, pitying. The MC crouched down, his smile faltering. "Thank you, sweetheart, but the starting bid today is $1,000. Is there an adult with you?" Mira lowered her head. Her small arms clutched the now empty jar. The room pressed in. Inside the cage, Tara let out a low growl through her teeth, a sound not quite threatening, not quite fearful. The MC cleared his throat. "Let's begin at $1,000. Do I have 1,000? A man raised his hand. 1,000! 1,200! 1,500! 1,800! The auction surged forward, like Mira wasn't even there, as if she were nothing more than a shadow drifting across the floor. She stepped back. Then another step. Her heart felt like stone. She didn't cry. She simply turned to leave, and then a metallic crash, a loud, vicious snap. Chains pulled tight, a violent rattle. The cage shook, gasps erupted. The MC froze mid-sentence. The attending officer stood up in alarm. Then, click! The cage door burst open. Tara lunged. It happened in seconds. Dozens of eyes went wide. Some people stepped back in panic. But Tara didn't attack, didn't rage, didn't lose control. She ran, straight to Mira. The girl turned just in time, eyes wide. The jar slipped from her hands and shattered on the ground. Before she could even react, Tara was there, pressing her head into Mira's chest. No bark, no growl, no command needed. Just an unspoken embrace, fierce and whole. as if, after all the loss, a heart had finally found where it belonged. Mira dropped to her knees, wrapped her arms around Tara's head. She didn't sob. She just buried her face in the thick fur, where her mother's scent still lingered. The crowd fell silent. The man in the gray suit stood abruptly. Rachel rushed forward, then froze. Neil hesitated, torn, eyes flicking, unsure whether to pull Mira away. But no one moved. Because in that moment, amid law, money, and powerful names, there were only two souls in the center of the storm. A girl who had lost her voice, a dog who had lost her partner. And now, they found each other. Not through words, but through a bond that needed no proof. In the moment Tara pressed her head into Mira's chest, the world seemed to stop moving. No one spoke. No one moved. No one even breathed too loudly. They all stood still, witnessing something that had slipped past protocol and legality. Something sacred, full of life, yet heartbreakingly fragile. The MC, a man who had hosted hundreds of auctions, big and small, found himself, for the first time, speechless. A police officer began to step forward, instinctively, but stopped midway. It was Tara's eyes, steady, alert, but completely without aggression, that froze him in place. This wasn't the action of a dog losing control. It was a choice, intentional, focused, resolute. Mira, still silent, buried her face deeper into Tara's thick fur. She trembled, not with fear, but because her small, guarded heart had just cracked open after months of silent lockdown. And then, amid that hush, the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing sharply across the wooden floor. The crowd parted without being asked. The man in the gray suit emerged from the aisle, stepping into the center of the tent. There were no introductions, no handshakes. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. His presence alone told everyone. This was Conrad Vale's man. From inside his coat, he pulled out a sheet of paper and placed it on the auction table. His voice was curt. Mr. Vale offers $5,000, payable immediately. A murmur spread like wildfire across the room. Some jaws dropped, necks craned. Eyes flicked from Mira and Tara to the stranger in the suit. $5,000 for a retired police dog? No one could make sense of it. The MC fumbled for his mic. His voice now shook. We have a new bid. $5,000 from Mr. Conrad Vale's representative. Do I hear any higher? No immediate response. Rachel looked at Neil. Neil clenched his fists. His jaw tightened. Mira remained by Tara, unmoved, expressionless, but with a quiet fire glowing in her eyes. She understood something the adults didn't. She was reading the truth they couldn't yet see. 6,000. A second voice, gravelly, aged, and worn with time, rang from the back. All heads turned. A thin, stooped old man rose from the last row. His long, silver hair brushed his collar. His faded khaki coat hung loose around his frame. His leather shoes were worn at the heels. He leaned on a cane and stepped slowly forward. 6,000, he repeated, eyes locked, not on Vale's man, not on the crowd, but on Tara. The buzz turned into a ripple of full-blown whispers. Is that Edgar Muir? No way, I thought he was dead. 10 years, he hasn't left that cabin in the valley since the incident. Edgar Muir, a name spoken like a legend. Former military, one of the most respected canine handlers in the Special Forces. After a classified tragedy over a decade ago, he had vanished from public life, living off-grid near the Thorn Ridge Woods. No one knew why Edgar was here today. Fewer still expected him to want Tara. The MC steadied his voice. We now have a bid of $6,000 from Mr. Edgar Muir. Would Mr. Vale's representative like to respond? The gray-suited man adjusted his earpiece. Then a pause, a signal. He raised 3 fingers. 9,000. The tent erupted. $9,000? What's going on here? Is there something hidden in that dog? But Edgar didn't flinch. He took a few more slow steps, stopping between Mira and Vale's man. His eyes never left Tara. 9,500, he said, voice iron-forged and steady. And I don't have anyone behind me. The money is mine. The reason is mine. Somewhere, surely, Conrad Vale was watching. His man's lips tightened. He touched his earpiece again. Another pause, then a nod. We bid 12,000. Silence fell across the tent. People shook their heads. The tension shifted, from curiosity to unease. This wasn't about a dog anymore. This was about something else, something no one dared name. Rachel turned to Mira. The girl was still seated on the floor, gently stroking Tara's fur, her eyes unflinching, calm, but alert. Neil reached for his phone, ready to call someone. Rachel stopped him. Wait, she whispered. Let it speak for itself. Who? Neil frowned. Not Mira, Rachel replied, eyes never leaving the scene. Tara. The bidding war between 2 powerful men escalated with every passing second. Each new number sent a fresh ripple through the tent. Heads turned, phones were raised, whispers turned to disbelief. But in the eye of that storm, where no one understood the real reason behind such absurd bids, a small girl still clung to the last flicker of hope. Mira sat curled beside Tara. Shattered glass lay scattered across the floor, coins rolling far, some reaching the feet of those seated in the front row, as if even pennies were trying to reclaim attention with their own meager worth. She bent down, hands trembling, collecting each coin. Dust smudged her fingers. A long scratch bloomed across the back of her hand, red against pale skin, blood welling up from where she had brushed a shard of glass. But Mira didn't stop. Rachel wanted to rush to her, to wrap her in her arms, to pull her from this pain. But her hand stalled mid-air. Something in her heart told her. This was the first time Mira had stood up, for anything or anyone, since the day Eliza died. Neil stood frozen. For the first time in years, he had nothing to say. Mira gathered the last of the coins and walked, shaking, to the center of the tent. Her footsteps echoed. Small but solid, as if gravity itself was pulling her down through the soles of her worn sneakers. She held out both hands, cradling the coins like a sacred offering. A breeze slipped through the seams of the canvas above, carrying pale sunlight with it. Her cotton dress fluttered lightly. Long brown hair veiled half her face. "What's she doing?" someone whispered. Another voice chuckled. Then a third, sharper voice cut the air. "She thinks she's a little princess here to rescue a dog." Laughter followed, not loud, but sharp enough to slice through the quiet. Mira didn't flinch. She reached the 100th, opened her hands. The coins trickled down, soft clinks into the man's open palms. The MC's voice caught. "Sweetheart, this is a real auction. Is this all you have?" Mira nodded. Her eyes didn't plead. They didn't panic. Just a tired, quiet look, like someone bracing for an answer they already knew. The MC lowered his gaze. The man in the gray suit chuckled, dry, smug. To him, this was nothing but a childish play. "Cute," he said, "but rules are rules, and rules aren't written in tears." At that moment, Tara rose to her feet. No one reacted fast enough. The dog moved like a shadow, silent, heavy, deliberate. She stepped forward. No growl, no bark, no aggression. Just a few slow steps, and she stopped. Right there, in the middle of the room. The air in the tent shifted, as if someone had pressed mute on the world. She looked at Mira, never blinking, never wavering. And that look, it wasn't a dog's gaze anymore, not a retired service animal, but the look of a witness, of a memory bearer, of a survivor carrying a truth no one else could hold. Edgar Muir slowly nodded from the side. "She's signaling," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, but enough for nearby ears to hear. "Tara's giving a signal." Mira froze. She turned toward Tara, her lips parted, a breath catching. She wanted to call her name. She wanted to scream it for the first time in months, but her throat clenched. Tears welled. The sound stuck in her chest. Tara moved again, one final step. Then she sat, right before Mira, lifted her head, pressed her forehead gently to the girl's. A sound emerged, not a bark, a breath, heavy, low, the sound of a history exhaled, and suddenly no one laughed anymore. There she stood, a little girl, hand cut and bleeding, filthy with dust and glass, and beside her a dog who had chosen her without question. And in that stillness, everyone understood. This was no longer an auction. This wasn't about power, not secrets, not control. This was about loyalty, the one thing money could never buy. The MC swallowed hard. His hand trembled as he raised the mic. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Mira opened her mouth, tried to speak, but no sound came. Rachel stepped forward, knelt beside her, and spoke softly. "Her name is Mira. Mira Eliza Lorne, daughter of Inspector Eliza outside." The wind surged. Flags on the poles snapped to life, and from somewhere deep in the crowd, a man's voice rang out, rough but steady. "Enough! Don't take that dog from her. What the hell are we even doing here?" The voice that had broken through the crowd hung in the air, disrupting everything like a ripple through glass. People turned, whispering, trying to process what had just been said. Then silence. And then he appeared. Conrad Valley. No announcement, no introduction. He entered the auction tent like he owned it, because, in many ways, he did. Light slanted down from the gaps in the canopy, bouncing off his steel-gray suit. It painted his face in cold relief, unreadable, like stone. Each step he took echoed on the wooden floor, sharp and final, like the ticking of an executioner's clock. His handler stepped aside with a bow. The MC gripped his mic like it might explode in his hands. Rachel instinctively pulled Mira closer, every maternal nerve on high alert. But Mira didn't move. She stood, small, silent, but no longer afraid. Conrad stopped just a few paces away. His eyes didn't go to Tara, not to the crowd. They locked onto the shattered jar on the floor, the few remaining coins scattered like tiny rebellions. "How touching," he said, his voice dry, like sand grinding through metal. A little girl and her souvenir coins, and a delusional dog pretending to be a hero. No one answered. "That girl," he flicked his gaze to Mira, "is just a child. Are you really willing to break protocol over a temporary emotional outburst?" His words echoed through the tent. Precise, calculated, each syllable designed to needle into doubt, into the fear of being wrong for doing what feels right. He took a step forward, then another. And that's when Tara growled. No one expected the sound. It wasn't a bark. It was something deeper. It came from her chest, low, resonant, ancient, like memory made noise. Someone gasped. A woman shrieked. A phone dropped to the floor. The MC staggered back. Edgar Muir's eyes narrowed. He knew. This wasn't rage. This was a warning. Conrad stood still, but his brow shifted subtly. A faint crease formed between his eyes. Mira clutched Tara tighter. She sank to her knees, wrapped her arms around the dog's neck, burying her fingers in the worn, thick fur. Tara stilled. but her eyes never left Conrad's. They burned like coals, unblinking, ancient, deliberate. Somewhere in her mind, somewhere behind the loyalty and the discipline, she remembered this man. "This child," Conrad continued, circling to Mira's left, "cannot possibly be entrusted with a former special service dog." His voice was clinical now, like a document being read into the record. No warmth, only structure, meant to corner, to convict. "She has no guardianship paperwork, no handler's license, no certification, nothing." And then, Edgar spoke, his voice low, graveled, unshaken. "She has one thing." Conrad turned, narrowing his eyes. "One thing," Edgar pointed at Tara. "She has the dog's choice, and if you've ever worked with animals like this, you know, they don't choose wrong." Silence. A gust of wind shook the tent. Flags flapped loudly outside. Sunlight fractured through the dust that floated in sudden golden streaks, and in the crowd, a feeling began to spread. Not curiosity, not sympathy. Dread. Why would a man like Conrad Vale come here himself, just for a dog? Neil stepped closer to Rachel. This isn't normal," he whispered. What if Tara knows something?" Rachel gripped his hand. "It's not a what if," she said. "It's a certainty." Tara never broke her stare, not once, not even to blink. The whole room was strung tight like piano wire, and at the center, Mira, kneeling, holding Tara, still silent, still unshaken. No tears, no words, no begging, just an embrace, one that spoke louder than any argument. And in that moment, it became clear to everyone. This wasn't about legality. This wasn't about policy. This wasn't about possession. This was about truth, about memory, and about a loyalty so deep, no amount of money could ever counterfeit it. After the chaos of the auction ended in Conrad's eerie silence, the crowd began to scatter, small groups slipping away quietly. No one spoke loudly. No one dared approach Tara. The dog sat perfectly still beside Mira, like a living iron gate, guarding something sacred. Conrad exited with his handler and a few staff in tow. He didn't look back. He said nothing. But everyone felt it, that lingering scent of danger, not the kind that screams defeat, but the kind that prepares in silence. That was when Edgar Muir, wrapped in his worn gray coat, tapped his wooden cane against the ground and approached Mira's family with slow, measured steps. "We don't have much time," he said. His eyes didn't land on anyone in particular. "Follow me. There's something you need to see." Neil glanced at Rachel, suspicion in his eyes. Rachel nodded slowly, then turned to Mira, who was still sitting between Tara and the shattered jar. The girl looked up, her face dry, unreadable, yet something in her gaze said it all. The real journey was just beginning. Edgar led them down a narrow trail behind the auction tent, where tall grass swayed above head height, and no footprints had passed in years. The path slipped into a thinning forest, where wind whispered through the trees like a slow, rumbling hymn. Tara stayed close to Mira, her flank brushing the girl's side like a loyal shadow. Rachel followed close behind, one hand on Mira's shoulder. Neil brought up the rear, gripping his useless phone out of instinct more than purpose. Edgar didn't explain. He walked with quiet purpose, stopping now and then to gesture at old claw marks pressed into the hard earth, or to tap a length of rusted wire dangling from a tree limb, clues the average person would overlook. Eventually, they reached a bend in the trail, a mound, slightly raised, shrouded by moss and low-hanging branches. "Here," Edgar murmured. He knelt, tapped the top of a flat stone with his cane, and carefully rolled it aside. Beneath it lay a shallow cavity, just deep enough for a small metal box wrapped in plastic. He handed it to Rachel. Inside were wrinkled pages, yellowed from moisture. Scrawled on the first sheet in strong handwriting, Eliza Lorne, not for official agency use. Neil frowned. What is this? Edgar looked up, and in his eyes was something hard to name. Respect, grief, guilt. Eliza met me here, he said. 3 times. The last was 2 weeks before the explosion. He paused, swallowing back something heavy, a shadow crossing his face, as if every word he spoke reopened a wound. She didn't trust the official records, the chemical warehouse contract, the permits, the reports. Everything was clean. Too clean. She told me there were chemicals stored in that facility that had never been logged, especially one shipment, codenamed D37X. No trace of it in any registry. But Tara, Edgar looked down at the dog. Tara reacted violently when trained near that zone. Rachel's voice trembled. You mean, what was in that warehouse could harm them? Edgar nodded. Slowly. Not just harmful, concealed, and the company leasing the warehouse was a Vale Group subsidiary. The air thickened. Neil spoke low. Did Eliza have proof? She was trying to collect it. She believed someone on the inside was orchestrating a clean sweep, removing documents, extracting the compounds quietly. He pointed to the bundle in Rachel's lap. That's her handwritten copy of what she gathered, but she never got the chance to send it. Because 2 days later, the warehouse exploded. Rachel sank onto a nearby stone. Her knuckles whitened around the papers. The air had turned colder. Mira remained silent, but the way she looked at Edgar now had changed. No longer curious, she understood. Deep in her bones, she had known. Tara carried a piece of the truth her mother had died for. Edgar continued. After the fire, I came back here. Waited. She never returned, so I buried these. And waited. Waited for who? Neil asked cautiously. Edgar's gaze didn't waver. Not who, what. I waited for the right moment. He turned to Mira. And when I saw her walk into that tent today, carrying a jar of coins, I knew. That moment had arrived. Silence again. Only the rustle of wind in the trees, the crunch of dry leaves underfoot. Edgar looked at Mira. You don't speak. But Tara understands, because she carries your mother's last memory. Mira didn't respond. Instead, she bowed her head, pressed her forehead to Tara's back, eyes closed, not to cry, but to listen, as if memory had a sound, and only the stillest hearts could hear it. The afternoon slid quietly toward dusk. The sun no longer blazed. It draped gold over the trees, bathing the forest in a melancholy calm, as if even nature had paused to reflect on the secrets just unearthed. Edgar adjusted his collar, his eyes distant, searching for a map drawn long ago in memory. She once told me, he said slowly, if anything happens, go north from this point. Follow the forest edge, under the split tree. He looked at Mira. But Tara must lead the way. Mira rose. She nodded once, calm, certain. She turned to Tara and whispered something that no one else could hear. And Tara understood. Ears perked. She began walking, not hesitating, not rushing, as if she remembered exactly where they needed to go. The forest grew thinner as they moved forward. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of damp soil and faint burnt resin, a ghost of the explosion that once scarred this land. Every step felt like it pressed into memory. Every breath stirred the silence of something never spoken aloud. Tara turned left at a cluster of tall grass, then stopped before a gnarled oak tree, its trunk splitting halfway up like 2 outstretched arms. The ground beneath the tree looked recently disturbed. The soil tamped, covered in leaves, as if something had once been buried here. Without needing command, Tara began to dig. Mira dropped to her knees beside her and joined in, hands scooping soil away with quiet urgency. The others, Rachel, Neil, Edgar, stood at a respectful distance, as if instinct told them. This was a space meant only for those Eliza had entrusted with her memory. The first layer was soft with rotted leaves. Next came compacted sand, darker in color. Then, suddenly, Tara paused. She sniffed the air, let out a short, clipped sound. Not alarm, a signal. Mira dug deeper. Her fingers struck something hard. Metal. She pulled it free. A small tin box, wrapped in black plastic and bound with copper wire. On its lid, written in faded red ink, "Do not open in direct light." Neil pulled a flashlight from his bag, switching it to low beam. Rachel retrieved gloves from the first aid pouch. The three adults instinctively stepped back as Mira peeled away the plastic. Inside the box, 3 small vials, each labeled in rough handwriting: D37X, a Beta 9, sample number 314, a leather-bound notebook fastened with a tiny zipper. Scribbled across its cover, "Death cannot bury the truth." Edgar inhaled sharply, his eyes locked on the journal like it was a fragment of a long-lost memory. "This is it," he whispered. "I saw her write in this. It's her encrypted log, where she recorded Tara's response to chemical traces." Rachel opened the notebook. Each page was dense with handwritten notes, chemical codes, and molecule diagrams. On one page, October 12th, Tara showed extreme reaction to vapor traces of D37X from 2.4 meters, heart rate spike, pupil dilation, mirrors response to class 3 cyanide. Another, October 14th, repeat reaction confirmed near East Warehouse sector. Conclusion, unregistered compound present. Edgar scanned quickly, then nodded. D37X was a neurotoxin rejected during wartime for being too unstable. If Eliza recorded this level of response from Tara, she'd struck a raw nerve in this town's history. Neil clenched his jaw. If Conrad had a hand in moving that stuff into the warehouse, then the explosion wasn't an accident. "No," Rachel said, voice tightening. "It was a cover-up, and Eliza was silenced." Tara now lay pressed against Mira's side. No growl, no bark, but her gaze never left the notebook, as if she remembered every page. Mira turned to the final entry. Just one sentence. "If anyone finds this box, trust Tara. She knows the way, and she'll lead you where I couldn't go." No one spoke. They stared at the notebook like it held a living heart, not human, but a heartbeat of truth, buried and still pulsing. From a distance, a new sound emerged, wheels crunching over gravel. Edgar lifted his head, voice low, grim. "Looks like we don't have much time to decide how we'll reveal this." The moon hung low above the rooftops of Ridgewood Hollow, casting a pale light over the empty streets, a quiet silver veil, as if the night itself was on the verge of revealing a secret it hadn't yet found the words for. After returning from the forest, none of them spoke. The tin box and Eliza's notebook were carefully wrapped by Rachel and hidden inside an old cookie tin, then tucked deep into the basement beneath the kitchen. But silence didn't soothe the tension. It only made it thicker. Like fog, you could almost breathe. Neil stood at the window, clutching a mug of cold tea. Rachel moved quietly through the kitchen, tidying up, though her eyes kept drifting toward Mira, who was curled on the living room floor, arms wrapped around Tara, her head resting on the dog's back like it was the last safe place left in the world. Then came the sound. Faint at first, the distant roll of wheels over gravel, ordinary enough in the middle of the night. But then, headlights swept across the window, cutting a line straight into Neil's eyes. He froze. The vehicle didn't move on. It stopped, Right in front of the house, a black SUV, sleek, silent, and unmistakable, the kind Neil had seen only in government documentaries. The windows were blacked out, but a mounted side mirror camera pivoted, pointing directly at the house. "Rachel!" Neil called sharply. She dropped the dish towel, rushing to his side. Together they stared out the window. The SUV remained motionless. No one got out. No lights flashed, no horn, just watching, memorizing, then a flash, once, then again, not aimed at the gate, aimed at the living room window, at Mira and Tara. Tara rose instantly, emitting a low growl. Mira gripped her collar, eyes wide, but not afraid. There was something new in her gaze now. Not panic. Resolve. As if fear had long ago turned to stone, and what remained was harder. Neil reached for his phone, fumbling to dial emergency services. But the SUV suddenly reversed, wheels grinding softly on the gravel, then turned and vanished into the night before the call could connect. The sound of tires on stone echoed a little too deliberately, not fleeing, just reminding. Later they sat at the kitchen table, the room wrapped in silence, broken only by the ticking of the wall clock. Neil set his phone down. His brow was furrowed. He looked at Rachel, then at Mira, who still hadn't moved from Tara's side. "We can't keep that stuff in the house," he said quietly but firmly. Rachel turned to him. "You mean Eliza's notebook?" "I mean the notebook," Neil said, fists clenched. "And the vials. They're dangerous. And it's clear now, someone knows we have them." "That's exactly why we shouldn't move them," Rachel said, not taking her eyes off Mira. "Not yet." "We should turn it over to the police," Neil pressed, the words coming too quickly, like a weight he was desperate to unload. "Or at least get a safety deposit box. We can't have a child and a dog as our only line of defense." Rachel opened her mouth to respond, but Mira stood up. She didn't say a word. She stepped toward the table, still holding Tara's collar. Then, slowly, she shook her head. Once. Clear, decisive, final. It was the kind of no that made the walls seem to echo with its meaning. Neil looked at her, exhaled sharply, and rubbed his temple. "I can't believe we're letting a kid decide." "We're not letting anything," Rachel cut in. "Mira knows exactly what this is, and she's not choosing fear. Maybe you should take a lesson from her." Neil pressed his lips together. The silence in the house no longer felt like suspense. It felt like the moment right before a storm breaks, when even the shadows seem to hold their breath. That night, Rachel stayed with Mira and Tara. The three of them lay under the soft glow of a bedside lamp, Tara's shadow cast against the wall like a sentinel, keeping watch. Neil remained in the living room, eyes never leaving the front door. A pistol lay in the drawer beside him, untouched for months since the day Eliza died. Down in the basement, the old cookie tin rested silently. But somewhere out there, the hunt had already begun. Rain began to fall as the clock struck 11. Not a storm. Not a loud downpour, but a slow, steady drizzle, the kind of rain no one notices at first, but it seeps in, through the cracks in soil, under door frames, into the silent creases of emotions left unspoken. It slipped through every corner of Ridgewood Hollow, laying a misty sheen over rooftops and over the worries growing silently inside the hearts of those still awake. Upstairs, in the attic room of a weathered house tucked away at the end of Laurel Street, a dim lamp still glowed. In that small space, Mira lay curled beneath a quilt. Beside her, Tara stood guard, half awake, half asleep, ears twitching with every whistle of wind that crept through the wooden seams. Between them sat Eliza's brown notebook, opened wide, caught in the quiet space between a child who could not speak and a dog who had never learned to lie. Mira had been staring at the symbols for hours. They weren't simple codes. There were no full sentences, no clear language. Each page looked like a fractured constellation, arrows, stars, slashes, hand-drawn with uneven spacing, varying weight, and subtle angles. Every mark had purpose. Before Eliza died, Mira had once seen her mother studying the notebook under a nightlight, tracing the markings with a face much like Mira's now, focused, wordless, but with eyes burning bright. Mira sat up and picked up a pencil. For the first time, she studied the notebook not as a mystery, but as a map. An arrow, then a star, then a slash. Repeating, over and over, she leaned in. The arrow, time, linear movement. The star, a critical event, a breakthrough. The slash. Mira hesitated. She traced it lightly with her pencil. A blockage, a dead end, a place where all clues were cut off. Tara lifted her head, sniffing along the edge of the notebook, almost sensing Mira's shift in understanding. The girl turned to her dog, tapped a finger gently on its forehead, and smiled. Rain tapped gently on the roof, a soft, wordless melody. Mira flipped to another page. Not just symbols this time, letters. But they weren't aligned in rows. They slanted diagonally along the page's edge, partially obscured by miniature molecular diagrams. One letter stood out. D, an arrow pointing down to .M, then a red star beside it. And below that, the letters. Con. Mira froze. She knew that name. The name Edgar had whispered in the woods, the name that made Rachel's voice tremble, the name that caused Tara to growl instinctively. Conrad. The next words. Conrad Vale, M. A red star encircled it faintly. Eliza had marked it, boldly, as if to warn. Next to it, 3 more coded names. C.WH, arrow down, LF, star with circle JK, cross, circle, arrow, backwards. Mira turned the notebook upside down, then used a mirror, just as her mother once taught her, to read the codes in reverse. And then, the names became clear. Councilman Charles Whitlow Lena Fry, Chair of the Health Board. Jacob Knorr, former Ridgewood Police Chief. Mira's breath caught. Her hand trembled. This wasn't just about Conrad. This was a network. She turned to Tara. The German shepherd gazed back, silent, steady. No words were needed. Just that look, that knowing. Mira placed her hand on Tara's head, gently drumming her fingers as if to calm herself, or to signal, I understand. Tara moved closer, rested her head on Mira's lap, a silent vow between them. We're in this together. The rain deepened, but Mira didn't sleep. She flipped through more pages, and now she began to see a pattern. Eliza hadn't written names in chronological order. She had written them as part of her investigation, layer by layer, each name emerging deeper into the spiral of secrecy. Near the back of the notebook, Mira found a hand-drawn map, a rough sketch of the chemical storage site where the explosion had happened. But something was off. A question mark sat far from the center, closer to an abandoned pumping station just outside town. Mira copied the map into her own notebook. She circled the marked spot. Tomorrow, she and Tara would go there. The rain kept falling, but it no longer sounded like dread. It was the rhythm of something awakening, a promise, stirring quietly in the dark. The morning after a sleepless night, the air inside the little wooden house had changed. Mira sat silently by the window, arms wrapped tightly around her mother's notebook, eyes fixed on the rain-soaked garden outside. Beside her, Tara lay close, occasionally flicking her ears toward the front gate, as if hearing something no one else could. Rachel stood in the kitchen, stirring a cup of coffee she never drank. Neil, with sunken eyes and rumpled clothes, stared at the hand-drawn map Mira had copied the night before, now spread out across the kitchen table. No one spoke. But they all felt it. Another storm was coming. Then came the sound of an engine, not the usual hum of morning deliveries. This was heavier, denser, like a warning. A sleek charcoal-gray SUV turned onto the gravel path leading to the house. No horn, no rush, but each turn of the tire seemed to grind down the breath of morning. Rachel froze, spoon slipping quietly into the sink. Neil stepped away from the table and moved to the front door. Tara growled low and steady. The vehicle came to a halt. The door opened, and Conrad Vale stepped out, wearing a dark wool coat, silver-streaked hair perfectly combed, black leather shoes gleaming. His face, all too familiar now, emerged beneath the dripping trees. He didn't hurry. He walked with calm certainty, as if every stone in the path belonged to him. Neil opened the door before he had a chance to knock. "Good morning," Conrad said in that low, measured voice, just loud enough to glide through the wooden threshold. "I hope I'm not disturbing your family too early." Neil didn't answer right away. He met the man's eyes without flinching, something in him having shifted. "What brings you here?" Neil's voice was rough, but grounded. Conrad smiled, soft, casual, like two old friends catching up over weather. "I heard about yesterday's auction, and about the girl." His eyes flicked toward the window, where Mira stood behind the curtain, gripping the notebook tighter. "I thought we should talk." Neil shifted, blocking the doorway. "Talk here." Conrad nodded, unoffended. He took one more step forward, then slowly placed a polished brown leather bag on the front step. "I didn't come to argue," he said smoothly, "just to offer a convenience. For everyone." Rachel now stood behind Neil. Mira hadn't taken her eyes off Conrad, and Tara, silent but alert, positioned herself between Mira and the door. Conrad knelt, unzipped the bag. Inside, a neat stack of cash and a slim folder. "I'm willing to reimburse every cent spent caring for Tara," he said without hesitation, "and offer your family enough to relocate, start fresh, peacefully. No one needs to dig up old names." His voice wasn't a request. It was a test, a velvet noose dangling gently, temptation wrapped in fear. Neil remained quiet. Mira held her breath. Tara lifted her head higher, growling now, clearly. Then Neil did something none of them expected. He picked up the bag and placed it right back into Conrad's hands. "We don't want your money." There was no drama in his tone, only finality, like a door locked from the inside. Conrad blinked. Just once. Then his voice dropped, colder now. "You understand what happens when children start mistaking justice for games, don't you?" For the first time, Rachel stepped forward. "Mira's not imagining anything. She saw, and Eliza died for it." Mira never looked away from Neil. She had never seen him stand this straight, speak this clearly, hold his gaze without flinching. "She was my daughter," Neil said, "and Tara is what's left of her. I won't let you touch that dog, and I won't let you bury what she died trying to uncover." Conrad's hand tightened around the bag. His smile was gone. "Then you've chosen your side," he said coldly. "Don't say I didn't warn you." He turned without another word, walking back with the same deliberate steps, but without the politeness he arrived with. The SUV roared to life. Tires sliced long streaks through the wet earth before disappearing behind the willows. Neil stood at the door, unmoving. Mira walked quietly to him and stopped at his side. He looked down, met her eyes. No words. Just a silent question. "Are you okay?" And Mira, for the first time in what felt like forever, nodded. Then, as if led by instinct, she wrapped her arms around him, not hard, not rushed, but real. A short embrace, but something in that moment healed. Behind them, Rachel wiped a tear she hadn't meant to shed. And Tara, the silent sentinel, stepped up beside them, watching, guarding, faithful as ever. In the kitchen, the coffee had gone cold, But no one noticed, because in Mira's heart, something far warmer had been rekindled. Trust. Afternoon fell over Ridgewood Hollow in hues of ashen gray, the scent of damp earth thick in the air. It wasn't raining, but something about the sky felt unfinished, like the storm was just beyond the horizon. Every step seemed to fall on something temporary, unstable, as if the whole town was holding its breath. Edgar Muir arrived unannounced. He didn't knock. He simply stood there, thin frame, fraying coat, and eyes that had grown far too familiar with grief. Tara was the first to notice. The German shepherd stood frozen at the door, then let out a soft whine, not a warning, but something gentler. She looked at Mira, then back toward the porch, as if signaling. Neil opened the door. Cold wind swept inside, carrying the faint, bitter scent of a burnt-out cigarette still smoldering in Edgar's hand. "I need to talk," Edgar said softly. "We can't put it off any longer." No one asked questions. They simply moved aside and let him in. They gathered around the round wooden table in the living room. Mira sat beside Tara, her hand resting on the dog's back like it was the only wall left standing between her and a world that had shattered too many times. Edgar removed his cap. His hair was a mess, but the kind of mess you comb carefully, out of respect for memory, not neglect. "I never told anyone the full story about my daughter," he began, voice rough and low, like pine bark in winter. "Her name was Molly Muir, 26 years old, biochemical tech at Meridian Biotech's lab. Smart, independent, asked the kind of questions people found uncomfortable, just like Eliza." That name struck a chord inside Mira. She sat up straighter. Rachel poured tea for Edgar, her hand trembling slightly. He nodded in thanks, but didn't drink. I don't know what exactly she discovered, but one day she came home, her eyes hollow, and whispered to me, "Dad, if something happens to me, don't trust the death certificate." Neil turned his face away. Rachel bit her lip. Mira didn't blink. Edgar looked at each of them, then sighed. 3 weeks later, she was dead. Her car lost control on a stretch of straight road, broad daylight, clear skies, no skid marks, no witnesses, no surveillance. The report said, "Single-car accident, unknown cause." He let out a bitter chuckle. It echoed awkwardly in the silent house. "I buried my daughter without ever understanding why, until Eliza came." Mira startled. "Eliza Parker?" Edgar nodded. Back then, no one really talked about her except in hushed tones. The woman who feared nothing. But she came to my door with a plain envelope. Inside were photographs, schematics, and a torn notebook page. Proof that Molly had sent internal reports about an experimental compound called LX9 being developed at Meridian. Neil narrowed his eyes. "What kind of compound?" "A biochemical agent, designed to neutralize toxins in soil. But if the concentration's off, it becomes a slow-release poison in water systems." Edgar pulled a crumpled sheet from his coat. A printed screenshot of an email. "Urgent. Risk profile on LX9. Eliza told me Molly had uncovered falsified data. They'd manipulated test results, buried leak warnings, and one by one, those who knew either quit or had accidents. Eliza looked me in the eye and said, 'I won't let Molly be forgotten.'" His eyes, clouded with time, shimmered for a moment. And she kept that promise. But in return, Eliza never came back either. No one spoke, only the ticking of the old clock filled the silence. Mira slowly opened her mother's notebook, flipping to a page with trembling fingers. There, scrawled in ink, was a line. "Meet Edgar, leads to Pinewood Lake, evidence on Molly." She pointed to the words. Edgar nodded. "Pinewood Lake. Near there was Meridian's first research outpost. Before they moved HQ, that's where Molly did her final work." He turned to Rachel and Neil. And if you think Conrad showed up just to claim a dog, let me be clear, LX9 didn't disappear. Those test vials Tara dug up, they may be the original samples, which means what you're holding is the fuse to this entire power structure. Rachel inhaled sharply. Neil nodded slowly. Mira stayed silent. But in her eyes, the sorrow had given way to something new, a slow, burning fire. Tara hadn't looked away from Edgar. It was as if she understood too. As dusk fell, Edgar rose to leave. Before stepping out the door, he placed a worn key ring into Mira's hand. Attached was a rusted tag that read, Pinewood, Research Wing A2. Eliza once said, "When I can't go any further, someone braver must walk forward." Maybe that someone is you. Then he turned and walked into the pines, his figure fading like a memory never properly buried. That night, in Mira's room, a small flashlight glowed over the map. She and Tara lay side by side. Eliza's notebook lay open, with the pinewood key placed in its center. Outside, the rain had returned, soft and steady, a whispering lullaby for truths left unsaid. Mira didn't speak. She simply placed her hand gently on Tara's chest. Then, in a voice so faint it was nearly breath, for the first time in over 6 months, Mira whispered, "You're not going alone, Mom. I'll carry it forward." Tara nestled closer, exhaling a deep sigh. As if at last, they understood each other completely. Morning settled over Ridgewood Hollow, with a weight that couldn't be measured. There was no rain, but the hills were thick with fog, so dense it blurred every shape in sight, as if the world were trying to hide something, or waiting for something to finally be revealed. In the small kitchen, pale light filtered through the dust-frosted window. Mira sat at the table, her mother's notebook in front of her. Next to it, 3 small vials, wrapped gently in cloth, and the rusted pinewood key Edgar had handed her. Rachel leaned against the counter, cradling a cup of untouched coffee. Her eyes never left Mira, though she said nothing. Neil paced in the living room, phone in hand, dialing no one. Only Tara remained still, curled beside Mira, head resting on her leg, ears pricked, as if listening for something hiding in the silence. Edgar was the first to break it. "We're running out of time," he said, his voice deep but not heavy. "Conrad showed up at your doorstep, and if I'm not wrong, he didn't come just to threaten." He placed a coarse cloth pouch on the table. Inside were photocopies, old emails, contracts, financial statements, evidence linking Meridian Biotech to several town officials, including at least 2 current members of the Ridgewood Council. "Eliza gathered part of this," Edgar continued. "The rest came from Molly and from me." He turned to Mira. "Today, if you're ready, we take it all to the council." A beat of silence. Neil finally looked up. "And if they don't listen?" "Then we make the whole town listen," Edgar said calmly. Rachel stepped forward and placed a hand on Mira's shoulder. "You don't have to speak, sweetie. We can speak for you. You just need to stay beside Tara." Mira looked at her, then turned to Tara. The German Shepherd lifted her head, licking Mira's hand. As always, no words needed. Just a single touch was enough to tether them. But this time, something was different. Mira's hand clenched slightly. Then, through a shaky breath, her voice emerged. Soft, fragile, but unmistakably real. "I'll speak." The kitchen stilled. Everything froze in that moment. Rachel's hand went to her mouth. Neil stood up abruptly, and Edgar paused, like he had just seen Eliza's soul pass through the doorway. Mira reached down, gently stroking Tara's head. "My mom didn't stay silent. Now it's my turn." They left the house at 9 a.m. Edgar's old pickup led the way, followed by Rachel's car, with Mira, Neil, and Tara inside. Ridgewood Hollow was no longer still. Something stirred beneath the fog, like an undertow rising. In the back seat, Mira pressed her cheek against Tara. For the first time, what stirred inside her wasn't only fear. It was a quiet kind of courage, born from silence, shaped by grief. When they arrived at Town Hall, a crowd had already formed. No megaphones, no banners, just hushed voices and tense eyes, proof that the whispers had traveled farther than they'd expected. And everyone seemed to know why 4 people and a German shepherd were walking through those doors this morning. At the steps, Rachel hugged Mira tight. Edgar handed her a copy of the notebook. And Neil, for the first time, rested a hand on Mira's shoulder. Not to guide her, but to say, "We stand with you." The doors opened. Inside, the council was already seated. 5 members, 4 men, 1 woman. 3 of them had appeared in Eliza's notes. A single page sat on the table, Conrad's pre-prepared incident report from the Pinewood explosion. Edgar didn't sit. He stood by the hearing desk, laying out the map, the evidence, the vials sealed in a cold pack. "We have proof," he began, "that a company operating under council-approved contracts has been concealing the existence of a biohazardous compound for over 3 years. Neil followed, slow but steady. "And we also have evidence that Eliza Parker, an investigator employed by this very town, was eliminated for getting too close to that truth." Rachel stepped forward, placing the notebook on the table. "These are the final records that survived." Silence. Council chair. Gerald Thorne, a silver-bearded man with a polite, practiced smile, asked, "Who's the official complainant on record?" Mira stepped forward. Her legs trembled slightly, but the hand on Tara's head remained steady. She took a breath, then spoke. "My name is Mira Collins. I'm the daughter of Inspector Eliza Parker. She died trying to protect the truth. And today, I only want to ask one thing. If grown-ups aren't brave enough to do the right thing, what's left for us kids to believe in?" Her voice wasn't loud. She didn't preach. But each word struck like a blade, cutting straight through the council's silence. No one moved. Tara lifted her head and growled low. And then, from the back of the room, clapping. Slow at first, 1 person, then 2. Then a row of Ridgewood residents stood up, applauding. No one told them to. They just knew. Something was finally right. And what's right deserves protection. When the presentation ended, the council retreated to chambers. No one knew what the verdict would be. But something far more important had already happened. Mira had spoken. Tara had stood beside her. And, for the first time, Ridgewood Hollow had listened. The air outside the Ridgewood Hollow Council chamber was still as stone. October wind swept through the old corridors, cold enough to sting the skin. But colder still was the waiting that gripped everyone seated in the gallery. At the front, the 5 council members had just returned from their private deliberation. Their faces were heavy, their eyes avoiding Mira's, or Edgar's. On the gray wooden table, everything had been arranged. Files, manila envelopes, rows of vials. Mira sat in the front row beside Tara. Her hand rested gently on the dog's head, not to be led, but to anchor something deeper. Faith. Council Chairman Gerald Thorne adjusted his tie and cleared his throat. "Before we announce our decision," he said, "the town has the right to hear the full evidence from the petitioners." Rachel rose first. She walked to the podium, no makeup, her voice trembling but steady. She unrolled the map Eliza had marked with chemical leak points around the Pinewood site, points that matched reports from independent labs. Then she presented copies of suspicious financial transfers from Meridian Biotech to 3 of the 5 council members, including Thorne himself. "We're not here to accuse," Rachel said. "We're here to deliver what Mira's mother died trying to uncover. She didn't die in an accident. She died because she knew too much." Then came Edgar, a bent old man whose back had surrendered to time, but whose voice rang like a bell struck against stone. He spoke of Molly, his daughter, a biochemist at Meridian who was killed in a car accident after sending an internal email about a banned compound showing up in production lines. He displayed a printout of that email. The recipient, Eliza Parker. She believed in my daughter, and my daughter believed in her. Now they're both gone, but the evidence is still here. So the question is, what does this council plan to do with the truth? No one on the council answered. Then Neil stepped forward. For the first time in months, Mira didn't look at him with coldness, but with a quiet effort to understand. He didn't read from notes. He didn't show maps or bank statements. He simply held up a photograph. Eliza holding a young Mira, with Tara beside them, her eyes bright as if smiling. "I doubted my own wife," he said. "I thought she was obsessed, paranoid. I even taught our daughter that grief should be hidden." He paused. "But I understand now. Grief doesn't disappear when we pretend it's not there. It seeps into our children." He turned toward Mira. "This girl didn't speak for nearly a year, but today she used her voice to defend a truth that all of us ignored. The question isn't whether we have enough evidence, it's whether we still have a conscience." The silence stretched long and heavy, until Dr. Emily Kerr, Mira's therapist, walked to the front. She was last on the list, but her words cut slow and deep. "I've treated Mira since the day her mother died. Her case involves trauma-induced mutism and severe psychological withdrawal. For months, she refused contact with anyone, even her own family." She turned toward Tara, lying silently at Mira's side. "But I witnessed the change, the reawakening, when Tara entered her life. A dog many saw as a pet, but in truth, a living therapy that allowed Mira to reconnect with the world." The chamber held its breath. Dr. Kerr unfolded a signed clinical report and continued. "I formally attest that separating Tara from Mira at this stage would cause significant psychological harm and jeopardize her recovery. I therefore recommend the Council grant legal designation of Tara as a therapy animal under Clause 22 of the Ridgewood Juvenile Care Act." Mira's hand tightened slightly, and Tara, sensing it, leaned up and licked her wrist. Their eyes met, no words exchanged, only understanding. Chairman Thorne stood. His face had lost its practiced calm. There was something in his expression that made Rachel squint. Was it guilt or fear? He cleared his throat. "We thank all speakers for their presentations. The Council will now vote on the following motions. 1. To officially recognize Tara as the licensed therapy animal of Mira Collins. 2. To initiate a formal investigation into Meridian Biotech's violations." The room held its breath. "I request a public vote," Rachel said, and for the first time, the entire chamber answered as one. "Agreed." Thorne hesitated, then nodded. One by one, the council members spoke, some hesitant, some firm. But in the end, all hands were raised. Both motions passed, unanimously. There was no applause, no cheers, only Mira turning to Tara, leaning close and whispering in her ear. And, for the first time, with no need to hide it, she smiled. When the last hand was raised inside the Ridgewood Hollow Town Council chamber, silence swept through the room. A silence not of peace, but of tension. As if everyone was bracing for thunder they knew would come. And that thunder had a name. Conrad Vale. From the back row, the man rose slowly, a cold smile etched across his face like a thin blade, not a wrinkle on his dark tailored suit, silver tie gleaming, steps so light even the wind seemed to part for him. "Touching," Conrad said, his baritone echoing as though he were giving a speech at a charity gala. "A tearful tale, a loyal dog, a girl who lost her voice, only to reclaim it at a hearing. Ladies and gentlemen of the council, what we've witnessed here is emotional theater. Some in the room turned toward him. Whispers stirred. But Conrad remained composed. He pulled a leather folder from his case. Inside, a copy of Eliza's notebook, leaked from some unknown source. "All the evidence they've presented," he said, holding up the journal, "rests in a personal notebook. No verification, no certified lab analysis, no official chemical forensics." He placed the notebook on the table and leaned toward Chairman Thorne. "If the council allows emotion to sway legal precedent, then today marks a dangerous precedent. Because if a diary can bring down a corporation, who'll dare invest in Ridgewood Hollow tomorrow?" Neil's fist clenched. Edgar muttered, "He's stalling." Conrad's gaze slid toward Mira, clutching Tara tightly. "She's a sympathetic child, and that's exactly what worries me. Are we letting compassion blur our judgment? Don't let pity cloud your reason." He stepped forward, just a pace. "And let me remind everyone, during the official Pinewood investigation, no trace of the described chemical residue was found. Eliza Parker's so-called evidence consists only of handwritten notes and old vials. Legally, that's nothing." Then Conrad turned to Edgar, narrowing his eyes. "And the testimony of a grieving father, whose daughter's death was never confirmed as a homicide, can hardly be considered unbiased." The air froze. Rachel started to rise, but a sound interrupted. Low, steady, unmistakable. A growl. Everyone looked around until they saw Tara, now standing beside Mira, muscles tensed, front leg shifting slightly to shield the girl. The sound came from deep inside Tara's chest, her eyes locked onto Conrad, unblinking, unflinching, as if she'd recognized something long buried in a forgotten nightmare. Conrad paused, expression unchanged, but his hand gripped the leather strap of his case. Tight. Rachel froze, her pupils dilated. A hand instinctively went to her chest, where her heart now pounded like an old fire alarm. Because Tara's eyes, right now, were the same as that night. That night when Eliza came home late, and Tara had stood growling by the fence, glaring into the woods. Back then, they'd assumed it was just a scent in the wind. But now? Now, there was no mistaking that look. Rachel whispered, not to anyone. She smelled it that night. The same scent. Neil turned to her, startled. "What night?" "The night before Eliza died." A hush swept through the chamber like a bird's shadow passing over cathedral walls. Edgar nodded, voice almost reverent. "Dogs don't forget." Tara didn't bark, didn't lunge. She simply stood, like a witness awakened from a year-long sleep. And now, it was clear to everyone. Tara saw Conrad Vale as guilty. Conrad took another step. Tara growled louder, a low primal warning. Chairman Thorne struck the gavel. "We ask Mr. Conrad to maintain distance from Ms. Mira's therapy animal." Conrad stepped back, face like marble. "So now a dog determines criminality?" No one answered, but the eyes in that room, every last one, no longer saw Conrad Vale as a man of wealth. They saw him as an unindicted suspect. The hearing was paused for 15 minutes. Rachel pulled Mira and Tara out into the moss-covered hallway. Edgar followed. Neil was asked to remain for evidence clarification. Out in the damp silence, Rachel turned to Edgar, voice shaky. "Do you believe Tara remembers the scent of Eliza's killer?" Edgar didn't hesitate. "I believe it more than anything Conrad just said." Mira sat beside Tara, stroking her back gently. She whispered, "You remember, don't you?" Tara didn't nod. She simply lay down again, resting her head against Mira's legs, eyes half closed. As if to say, no, she wasn't crazy. She had only been silent, waiting for the world to be ready to listen. The town chamber of Ridgewood Hollow returned to near silence after the 15-minute recess. But what had changed wasn't the creaking wooden chairs or the faded yellow lights. It was the atmosphere, dense like early fog, not from fear, but from the weight of something much greater, about to be unveiled. Mira stepped back in with Rachel, Edgar, and Tara by her side. She still said nothing. Still the same small figure in a room too large, her canvas shoes dusted with dirt, an empty donation jar tied to her backpack, a quiet reminder of how this all began. But her eyes, they were no longer the eyes of a child enduring. They were the eyes of someone who'd taken on a final promise for someone no longer there. The council resumed their seats. Chairman Thorne struck the gavel once. "We continue the hearing. Is there anyone else who wishes to speak before the final deliberation?" A beat of silence. Rachel began to rise, but a small hand touched hers. Mira didn't speak, but her gaze said enough. Rachel slowly sat down. Mira walked forward. The room swallowed the sound of her steps against the wood. Edgar gave a slight nod, eyes warm like a porch light left on. Tara followed at her side, tail brushing the floor like a paintbrush trailing time. She stood at the center. She didn't need to speak. No one would have blamed her. Just standing there was enough, many believed. But then, a voice, soft as a winter breeze, sharp as a blade of truth gliding over skin. "He's not evidence." She didn't look at the council. She looked at Tara, then at the photograph of her mother, Eliza Parker, carefully placed beside the frayed notebook. "He's what's left of my mom." The words shattered the silence. No one breathed, no one moved. Rachel covered her mouth. Neil gripped the edge of his chair. Edgar closed his eyes. And Tara, as if understanding every syllable, lifted his head and gently brushed against Mira's leg. Her voice grew stronger, as if rising from the highest peak of memory. "My mom always believed he knew things people were afraid to believe. When she didn't come home, he waited. All night, in the yard." She turned to face Conrad. Her eyes didn't flinch. "He knows who made her never come back. He doesn't need to lie, he only knows loyalty." A muffled sniff came from the back row. An elderly librarian, the one who used to register Eliza's name at the public library. But Mira kept going. "Everyone told me to forget, to move on. But Tara never said that. He just stayed. Quiet. Beside me. Just quiet. And I lived because of it." She knelt, gently placing a hand on Tara's head. "If you call him evidence, then my mom is just a file too. But she's not a file. She's a person. She's light. And Tara is the part of that light that stayed." A full minute passed. And then the room didn't erupt. It shifted. Slow, deliberate applause began from the back. A man with a Ridgewood veteran pin. Then a retired teacher. Then a mechanic who once fixed Eliza's car. No one said a word. They simply stood and clapped. Chairman Thorne gripped the gavel tightly, but did not strike. His eyes were red. "Young lady," he meant to speak, but stopped. There was nothing left to add after what Mira had said. Conrad Vale sat frozen. The cold in his stare no longer outshone the warmth rising from the people now rising on the other side. Mira's therapist, standing at the edge, added her final words. "I formally acknowledge. Today, Mira has regained her voice. By standards of the National Trauma Response Association, this is a clinical breakthrough. And I emphasize, Tara is her only functional therapy. No medication, no counseling technique has come close to what this dog's presence has done." A hush rippled again. No one could say exactly when the tide turned. But from that moment on, the current had changed. Mira sat down. Tara curled beside her, resting his head on her shoe like a pillow woven from memory and voice. And someone, no one knows who, whispered aloud, "That little girl just did what the whole council couldn't." She spoke the truth. Another voice answered, "And he's not evidence. He's a witness." The silence in Ridgewood Hollow's town hall was no longer an absence. It was an echo, a space where something had taken root, a truth no longer confined to coded notebooks or test tubes sealed in Edgar's worn leather bag. The truth now lived in a girl named Mira, in her eyes, no longer hiding, and in a dog named Tara, whose stare held no compromise. Chairman Thorne took a deep breath. He looked at each council member as if searching for a shared strength, then turned to the public. "I've worked in public office for over 30 years. His voice was low but steady. But I've never witnessed anything like today. A child speaking the truths adults have buried. A dog carrying the memory of a buried crime." No one interrupted. "This is not about whether to keep a dog. This is about whether this town still recognizes what justice looks like." He turned to the council. One by one, they nodded. No words were needed. The agreement was clear as daylight. Thorne inhaled again. "Given the weight of what we face, I propose a rarely used motion. Today we are not just a council. Today, we are a community." He extended his hand toward the people gathered. "I call for a public vote from all Ridgewood citizens present on 2 matters. He held up 2 fingers. "First, do we, as a town, formally recognize Tara, a retired K-9, as the official and legal emotional therapy companion for Mira Eliza Collins, who has just regained her speech after prolonged trauma? Second, do we, as a town, approve launching a full investigation into the operations of Meridian Biotech, including all parties potentially involved in the death of former Inspector Eliza Parker and other missing persons in this region?" For a moment, the room froze. Then, one hand went up. Mrs. Moreno, the librarian, face etched with lines, eyes clear like glass. Then another. Then more. Row by row, hands lifted, from veterans to students, mechanics, nurses, teachers. No one stayed seated. No one hesitated. No one turned away. Neil looked at Rachel, and for the first time, both raised their hands together, without needing words. Edgar, standing in the back, lifted his farmer's hand, a hand that trembled with age, but held firm in conviction. Chairman Thorne swallowed. His eyes swept the room, then stopped at Conrad Vale, still seated in the corner, gripping his cane like a quiet threat. But Conrad did not raise his hand. Not because he didn't want to, but because he knew. He was no longer on the right side. Tara let out a low growl, not in warning, but in confirmation. His eyes briefly met Conrad's, then returned to Mira. Mira didn't look back. She just sat there, in a sea of raised arms, eyes glistening and lips curling into the first real smile she'd worn in nearly a year. Thorne struck the gavel. "The town of Ridgewood Hollow hereby votes..." Thud. "To recognize Tara, a retired K-9, as the official psychological support animal for Mira Collins." Thud. "And..." He paused. "To authorize a criminal investigation into Meridian Biotech and every individual or corporate entity named in the files left behind by the Collins family, Mr. Edgar Muir, and the late Inspector Eliza Parker." Thud. The sound echoed like a bell, redeeming what had long been buried. A breath of relief swept through the room. Not a celebration, but the quiet exhale of people who had survived the storm. Tara licked Mira's hand. She smiled. Then turned to Rachel, the mother not by blood, and whispered the first word she had ever directed at her. "Mom." Rachel broke down in tears. Neil, behind them, rested a hand on Edgar's shoulder, his spine straight, as if he had just repaid a silent debt to Eliza. In the back of the room, a photojournalist captured the moment. Mira, her arms around Tara, surrounded by dozens of raised hands. That photo would later hang in the main hallway of the Ridgewood Hollow Town Hall, captioned, "When a child speaks, an entire town listens." The night wind in Ridgewood Hollow carried the scent of rain-soaked earth, winding its way through cracked window frames and somehow into the corners of the heart. In a modest wooden house at the end of Birch Lane, the soft amber light from Mira's room was the only one still awake, the last ember glowing in a town that had lived through a day unlike any before. Mira didn't sleep, not because she was restless, but because, for the first time in almost a year, she wasn't afraid of her dreams. Tara lay curled at the foot of the bed, head resting across Mira's legs, ears twitching every now and then at the sound of owls calling from the distant hills. But soon, he let out a long, heavy breath, the kind of exhale only a soldier gives after the war is over. Mira reached down and gently stroked his head. A thank you. A whisper. Something even she couldn't name. In her lap lay a worn leather notebook, its last page open. The paper was wrinkled, the edges soft and frayed, as if someone had turned it again and again with damp, anxious fingers. Under the desk lamp's gentle glow, Mira read the words she'd repeated in her head all afternoon. But this time, she read them slower, as if each letter was her mother's breath returning through memory and light. If you're reading this, then you're braver than I ever dared to be. Mira's eyes didn't blur. She didn't cry. She didn't press her lips together and swallow grief. She simply tilted her head and whispered, "I read it, Mom." Her voice was soft, like smoke, like a night flower's shadow. But it was there, warm, steady, like a chain breaking. Tara stirred. He shifted closer, his nose touching the edge of the notebook, as if he too was reading, as if he remembered. Mira traced her fingers over the final line. "If one day you feel lost, remember, Tara isn't just a dog I trained. He's a map, a piece of my soul I left for you." She flipped back a few pages. Messy red markings, crossed out words, dates, maps of the forest, and a strange note written in her mother's shorthand. DAR, Delivery Asset Route. She didn't understand all of it, not yet. But she would. Not alone. With Tara. The moonlight poured through the thin curtains, catching in the tousled strands of Mira's hair. Outside the window, crickets whispered, and the trees brushed against each other like old secrets. Mira closed the notebook, slipped it gently into the drawer by her bed, as if placing a piece of her heart into safekeeping. She leaned down and wrapped her arms around Tara's head. His fur, soft and slightly damp, felt like a living pillow of primal loyalty. "You know what?" she whispered, cheek against his brow. "Mom said you were a part of her soul. Maybe you were also the voice I lost." Tara didn't respond. He simply nudged closer, then closed his eyes. The room fell silent. No more wind, no more footsteps, just the breathing, slow and steady, of two souls once shattered, now quietly stitching each other back together. Downstairs, Rachel sat quietly by a cup of tea, gone cold. Neil stood by the window, gazing toward the forest's edge, where a faint yellow light still flickered beyond the mist. "She spoke," Rachel whispered, not turning, her voice cracked, part joy, part relief. Neil didn't reply, but the hand gripping the window frame slowly eased. He looked over at her and said simply, "Tomorrow?" Rachel finished it for him. "Tomorrow is the truth." They didn't say anything more. They didn't need to. Because tonight, the miracle didn't come from hearings or evidence. It came from a small attic bedroom where a girl had found her voice and a dog had found his home. That morning, Ridgewood Hollow was wrapped in a thin veil of sunlight. No more smoke, no more murmurs of doubt. The wind whispered through white fences, past the worn porches, and carried with it the last traces of a long, restless season, leaving only clear skies and the promise of a new day. Mira wore a beige coat. Her old canvas shoes, freshly cleaned by Rachel, tapped softly on the pavement. On her back was a small backpack carrying just 3 things: a scrap of paper with Eliza's first written words, an old photograph of 3, mother, daughter, and dog, and a blank canvas frame, untouched. Tara walked beside her. His pace was calm, steady. He no longer moved like a dog carrying wounds, even if the scars still traced across his chest. People in town watched them pass, the 2 survivors, with quiet, reverent eyes. They didn't call out their names. They didn't need to. At the lobby of Willow Hollow Pediatrics, a young nurse opened the door the moment she spotted Tara's silhouette through the glass. Her smile bloomed like a morning bell. "Welcome back, little heroes." Mira didn't speak. She simply nodded. Tara wagged his tail gently, as if speaking for both of them in a language that required no words. Room 3 was their first stop. Inside, a boy, around 8, sat with his back to the door, staring out the window. His hand rested on a pillow, fingers thin and still, his eyes distant. Mira approached quietly. No hesitation. Tara moved slower, then sat beside the bed, just a few handspans away. No one spoke. The wind outside nudged the curtain. Light spilled across the floor. And then, the boy turned. His eyes met Tara's. For the first time in weeks, the boy exhaled. Not out of fatigue, but like someone had unlocked the door to a room inside his chest. He reached out, hesitating. Tara didn't rush. He tilted his head, stepped forward, and gently rested his chin in the boy's open palm. Mira sat beside him. She reached into her backpack and pulled out the photograph. The boy glanced at it, then asked softly, "Is that your mom?" Mira nodded. She didn't need to say more, and truthfully, the boy didn't need the full story. He just needed someone to stay, someone solid, someone like Tara. A senior nurse at the door wiped her eyes. A young doctor turned away, removing his glasses to hide his tears. Room by room, Mira never retold the battle. She didn't mention toxins, notebooks, or rainy nights in council chambers. There was only presence, only silence. Only Tara, placing his head in the laps of children who hadn't spoken, hadn't cried, hadn't dared to trust, and things began to shift. By late afternoon, as sunlight stretched across the dirt path behind the hospital, Mira stepped outside. Rachel waited but didn't walk in. She simply nodded, letting Mira and Tara continue on foot. They followed the narrow trail leading to the eastern field, once Eliza's training ground. The grass had grown knee-high, wild reeds swayed in the breeze. The sun mellowed, casting golden syrup across the land. Tara walked ahead, parting the tall grass with every stride. Mira followed, not quickly, not slowly. The field still held echoes of Eliza's commands. Faded footprints, a forgotten training stick by the brook, stones arranged in a circle, once used for sit, stay, wait. Mira stopped in the middle. Tara stopped too. She took off her backpack and opened the blank canvas. Her hand trembled as she placed it on the ground, but her smile was light, like a drifting cloud brushing her cheek. Mira lifted her brush. She didn't paint her mother. Not Tara's face either. She painted a gaze. The way Tara had looked at her during the auction. That look that silenced a crowd. That stopped the world for just a second. That look, was the bridge that brought Mira back to life. She painted in silence. Tara lay beside her, resting his chin on her ankle, breathing evenly. A dry leaf drifted onto Mira's shoulder. The sun edged west, casting the long shadows of two survivors across the golden dirt of Ridgewood Hollow. That night, no one asked what came next. They didn't need to, because the fight no longer lived in debates or boardrooms. It lived here, in the decision to keep walking, to not go quiet, to never abandon those still holding on to hope. A new chapter had begun, with a girl who had found her voice, and a dog who never stopped watching over the one he loved. And perhaps the most beautiful thing Mira and Tara left behind wasn't just justice served or secrets revealed. It was the resurrection of a soul that seemed lost, her voice, her family, her faith, revived by the gaze of a loyal dog. Love, loyalty, silent memory. These became her map, not just for Mira, but for anyone who had ever felt adrift in a cold world. Tara, this German shepherd, couldn't speak, but he understood more than most. His kind didn't just offer strength or intelligence. They carried a heart that listens, a spirit that guards, a soul that loves. And in his silent devotion, he brought Mira back. He gave a town the courage to face the truth. And he reminded us all, sometimes healing comes in the quietest forms, a head resting on your knee, a tail wagging through the storm, a decision not to walk away when it matters most. Mira and Tara stepped out of the shadows. And when their small shadows stretched across the morning grass, we understood. There are bonds, once formed, that nothing can break. And that is what German shepherds and all the silent, steadfast souls of the world have been trying to teach us all along. One quiet morning in the forest, an old German shepherd stood guard beside a trembling fawn. No words, no commands, just presence, and somehow that was enough to save a life. They weren't the same species, didn't speak the same language, but their bond grew like family, until one gunshot shattered everything, and nothing was ever the same again. Can the friendship between a dog and a deer survive the wild's harshest truth? What happens next will stay with you long after the story ends. You know how some places just feel quieter than they should be? Like the air itself is holding its breath? That's what March evenings in Sewanee were like. Even before the sun dipped behind the pine trees, the light would start to fade. It didn't disappear. It thinned, like mist brushing over the tops of tired trees, settling on the riverbank like a memory no one asked for. The Sewanee River used to rush wild and fast, chattering over pale stones, echoing against the cliffs. But not anymore. Now it looked cracked and dry, like the skin of an old man who's lived too long. The riverbed was a patchwork of brittle mud and forgotten rocks, jutting up like broken teeth. It was along that road, kicking up little puffs of dust, that an old gray pickup rumbled forward. The engine gave a tired cough. Inside, Caleb Weiler sat behind the wheel, eyes fixed ahead. Beside him, curled up like he always was, lay Alden, his German shepherd. 8 years they'd had each other. 8 years of quiet mornings and broken days. Alden's ears twitched with every snap of a twig beneath the tires, but his eyes stayed half shut, his head resting gently on Caleb's leg. That was how they always rode shoulder to shoulder, not as man and dog, as something quieter, something more human than most people could explain. Caleb's house sat alone at the top of a low hill, 4 miles outside the town. No neighbors, no streetlights, just wind, pine trees, and the sound of rain ticking against a tin roof whenever night came down hard. He hadn't always lived like this. There was a time when Caleb built homes, raised a child, kissed someone goodnight. That was before the storm, before the fire, before everything turned to ash. Since then, he'd let the world go on without him, let it forget. All he kept was Alden. And in the evenings, when the sky wasn't crying, Caleb would drive along the river. No reason, no destination. Sometimes just to smoke a cigarette and feel what silence felt like. Sometimes to listen to the same old tapes crackling through a radio that hadn't been replaced in 20 years. Old songs that sounded like they were coming from behind a closed door in the past. Alden always came along. No leash, no commands. It was understood if one got in the truck, the other followed. Simple as that. That evening, Caleb slowed to a stop near a bend where the river still held a little water. He let the engine hum for a second, then rolled the window halfway down. A breeze drifted in. Damp, muddy. It carried the smell of wet roots and buried things. He lit a cigarette. The tip glowed orange for a moment. The flame crackled. And that's when Alden moved. Not just stirred, moved. Fast. In a blink, Alden was up, body tense, ears pinned forward, staring ahead like he saw something no one else could. Then, that low growl. Deep. Controlled. Not loud, but enough to make Caleb turn, his heart skipping just once. "What is it, boy?" he asked, but Alden wasn't listening. He had both front paws on the truck door now, nose tilted toward the water, breathing like he was chasing something only he could sense. Caleb sat up straighter, looked where Alden was looking. The river was still. Cold and gray. Same as always. But Alden wasn't the same. It was like something invisible had grabbed hold of him, something ancient, something urgent. Caleb stubbed the cigarette out in the tray, following Alden's line of sight with his own. And there, at the far end of the river bend, where the water still pooled deep in a quiet pocket, something moved. Just a ripple, a shift in shadow. Then a gust of wind swept over the rocks, sharp and sudden, and for a breathless moment, everything stopped. No birds, no tires crunching gravel, only the soft trickle of water. And something else. Something that sounded almost like a voice. Calling. Faint, but real. Like the river itself was whispering. Like something down there was waiting. And Alden, he heard it first. It was barely a sound. Small. Almost not there. But it was enough to stop Alden in his tracks. A sound like that doesn't come from the wind. It doesn't come from birds or trees. It comes from something lost, something scared, something holding on by a thread. It slipped through the silence like a whisper wrapped in water. Wet, shaky, and fading. Like a breath that didn't know if it wanted to keep going. It was the kind of sound that slips into the back of your mind and makes everything still. Alden surged forward, both paws hammering the door. His nails scraped against the window in frantic beats, each one sharper than the last. His eyes were wide, locked in. No calm, no hesitation. Just something raw, something urgent. Caleb opened the door without thinking. Alden was already gone. He hit the ground running, nose stretched toward the river, letting out a low, tense growl. It wasn't loud, but it carried weight. It sounded like the kind of warning that comes when time is almost out. Caleb stood frozen. The river in front of him wasn't just a river anymore. It was a wound. That same spot, that same bend in the water, that same gray sky. It all came back, a piece of the past, cracking open in real time. And in that moment, he didn't see Alden. He saw his son. That look, those eyes, that soft, desperate cry. It had happened here, years ago, Same time of day, same broken sound. Back then, Caleb had moved too slow, just a few seconds too slow, and by the time he reached the edge, the boy was gone, pulled under by something no one could fight. Not then, not now. Alden growled again. Louder. Then he ran. His paws slammed against the ground, kicking up dust and broken pebbles as he darted toward the edge. Caleb flinched, called after him, voice hoarse, barely holding together, but Alden didn't stop. He leapt straight off the rocks and into the water. The splash echoed like a crack of thunder in the quiet. Caleb ran forward, knees hitting the ground as he reached the bank. His chest tightened. The cold from the river seeped into his bones even from where he knelt. Alden surfaced fast, strong, focused. He scanned, found the spot, then swam. Each stroke steady. Sure, unshaken. And then Caleb saw it. Floating in the center of the river, spinning slowly, was something small, something barely moving, a patch of pale brown fur, legs curled inward, head tilted back toward the sky. No fight left, just drifting, like it had almost let go. Caleb clenched his fists. He didn't know what it was, that thing floating out there. An animal? A shadow? A trick of the light? But Alden's eyes never wavered. And that was all Caleb needed to understand. If he stood still now, if he waited even 1 second too long, something else would be lost. Again. He lowered his voice, steady but sharp. Alden, go. Just 3 words. Quick, precise, like a line between life and death. Alden looked back. Just for a heartbeat. Just long enough to say, I hear you. Then he launched himself forward, a clean, fierce leap. His nose broke through the surface like a blade, slicing into the muddy water like it was glass. The splash came hard, sudden. Ripples spread in tight circles, then faded into the swirl of the quiet current. Caleb ran to the edge, his hands slammed down against the cold stone, knees in wet sand, eyes locked on the water, tracking every shift and ring where Alden had gone under. His heart was pounding. His chest felt crushed from the inside, like something heavy had settled over it and refused to move. He didn't know what scared him more, that the small creature out there might already be dead, or that it might still be alive. Alden surfaced once. His back broke through the surface, eyes scanning, sensing. Then, without pause, he dove again. This time deeper. Longer. Caleb swallowed. His throat was dry, his breath stuck halfway. The air was thick. His mind, louder than the wind, was playing everything back, those old memories, unspooling like broken film. The river. That storm. His son's tiny hands flailing in the rain. The scream. The desperate splash. And those eyes wide open, never closing. A jolt beneath the surface. Something broke through. Alden rose from the water, mouth clamped gently around something small. A shape. Drenched. Limpio. Its fur was soaked through, thin limbs hanging like thread. The tiny body sagged, head tilted, motionless. Caleb couldn't tell what it was. A puppy? A kitten? Just a bag caught in the weeds? But Alden's eyes, sharp, locked in, unwavering, said everything. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't debris. This was someone. Alden kept the little creature's head lifted just above the waterline. The rest of its body dangled below the surface, hidden by the river's murky swirl. Alden's strokes slowed, now labored. His body pushed forward against the pull, steady but strained. It was like he was carrying breath itself. Fragile, almost too light to hold. Caleb leaned in, hands bracing against his knees, wind cutting across the back of his neck. His ears were ringing. He couldn't hear the river anymore, couldn't feel the ground. Everything narrowed into that single moment, a dog swimming against the current, carrying something nameless toward him. Then suddenly a burst of motion. Water broke open in a sharp splash. Alden gave a strong kick, lifting his head and the tiny form higher above the surface. The creature was still limp, still shivering, still not moving. Caleb stopped breathing. Alden kept going, pushing closer. Stroke by stroke. Bringing it home. Bringing it back. Each movement sent ripples curling outward, soft rings melting into the dusk. The riverbank was slick and flooded now, the mud giving way beneath Caleb's boots, but he didn't care. He was already down, arms open, waiting. And then Alden was there. Close enough. Caleb reached forward, caught the tiny body as Alden rose up from the water, soaking and shaking. He laid the creature down on the wet grass, small, cold, completely limp. For a long second, Caleb just stared. Thin, matted fur, ribs poking out from under the skin, breath so shallow it barely moved the chest. It looked more like a shadow than something living, something lost too long, but it was breathing. Just barely. Then the last light of the day fell across its fur, just enough to catch on the delicate strands. And there they were, tiny white specks, scattered along the damp brown back like wildflowers pressed into the earth. It was a fawn, no bigger than a school backpack, eyes wide and glazed, ears trembling. Its entire body looked like it had been made from nothing but bones and skin. Caleb didn't think. He just moved. He tore off his heavy coat and draped it over the tiny form, hands trembling as he gently wiped its face, bit by bit. Then he slid his fingers under the hind legs and lifted, slowly, carefully, letting the water drain from its mouth and nose. A trickle of cold river water ran down the side of its cheek. Then its lips twitched. A tiny gasp cracked out. Then another. Thin, broken, like a thread trying to hold on to one last breath. Alden stayed close, silent. Not a bark, not a sound. He leaned in, nose brushing the little fawn's ear, then gave it one soft lick. Just one. His warm tongue swept gently over a patch of mud on its forehead. It wasn't something taught. It was instinct. It was knowing somehow that what mattered most in that moment wasn't strength. It was tenderness. Caleb sank to the ground, legs folded, eyes fixed on the bundle under his coat. Around them, the whole world had gone still. No breeze, no birds, not even the river moved. Only one thing stirred now his memory. Because years ago, at this very riverbank, he had knelt the same way. He had cradled a small, cold body, pulled from the water just minutes too late. No breath, no sound. Just a face, frozen in a question no one would ever answer. That was his son, Sam, 6 years old. Wild curls and eyes that lit up every time he spoke about animals. Sam believed lost creatures were always waiting for someone kind enough to find them. That afternoon, they'd been walking this same stretch of river. Sam heard a noise near the reeds and darted ahead, said it was a baby squirrel, or maybe a fox. Caleb couldn't remember. Sam had shouted, "I'll name it Dottie." The spots on its back looked like the cookies Mom made. Then he'd taken off, tiny shoes sinking into the wet grass. Minutes later, Sam slipped into the water. And the world never felt whole again. Caleb had jumped in after him. He pulled Sam out. But it was too late. After that day, he stopped walking the riverbank when the water was high, and he never spoke the name Dottie again. Not once. Not until now. The fawn let out a breath. Not a cry, not a full sound, but something. Something alive. Caleb leaned in, touched its forehead with one finger. It was ice cold. But it was alive. Alden settled beside them, tail brushing the dirt in a slow, thoughtful rhythm. His ears still pointed straight, eyes fixed on the little fawn's chest, watching each rise, each fall, quiet, present, as if he knew something had passed between the two small beings. Something invisible, but strong. Caleb tightened the coat gently around the fawn's body, then lifted it with both arms. So light, so terribly light. It felt like if he loosened his grip for even a second, the fawn might vanish into the wind. He stood slowly, met Alden's eyes, gave a small nod. "Let's go," he said. Alden turned, walking ahead toward the truck, and in that quiet moment Caleb knew. This wasn't just another March evening. Something had shifted. Something had come back. Something had begun. Caleb opened the truck door and reached behind the seat, pulling out an old blanket that smelled faintly of pine and dust. Gently, he laid the little fawn down, tucking his coat beneath it like a second layer of warmth. The creature didn't stir. It just breathed softly, barely. Each rise and fall of its chest was like a whisper, a thread pulled tight, clinging to life with everything it had left. Alden didn't leap into the truck like he usually did. Instead, he paused beside the open door, eyes on Caleb, waiting. Then, with quiet resolve, he stepped up onto the passenger seat. But he didn't lie down. He sat sideways, his entire body turned toward the back, toward the little life curled beneath the blanket. Caleb climbed into the driver's seat. The old engine coughed once before humming to life. Dashboard lights flickered gently. The radio crackled on like it always did, static. Then that familiar low voice. But Caleb turned the dial off before the song could begin. He didn't want music, not now. Not over this moment. The truck rolled forward, slow and steady, its tires humming against the dirt road that curved through the edge of the woods. Outside the window, white grasses swayed in the wind like soft brush strokes, painting the fading day. But inside the truck, the silence felt different now. It wasn't empty. It wasn't cold. Caleb glanced at the rearview mirror. The fawn was still there, tucked beneath the blanket, its tiny head tilted slightly to one side, resting against the folds of cloth. Beside it, Alden stayed perfectly still, not watching the road, not even glancing at Caleb, just keeping his eyes locked on the fragile figure in the back seat. It wasn't alertness. It was something else. Protection. Then, as the last of the evening light spilled through the back window, Caleb noticed something new. There, glowing faintly on the fawn's wet fur, were the white spots, tiny, round, and scattered like raindrops caught on morning leaves. So familiar, so heartbreakingly familiar. He swallowed hard. And without planning to, without thinking at all, he whispered it aloud. Dottie. The name just came out. No filter, no hesitation, just memory, wrapped in the shape of a word. But because it came from nowhere, it hit everywhere. It was a name that hadn't touched his lips in years, a name his son had once given with bright eyes and a sticky-fingered grin. Sam had been 6, all curls and crayons, and a heart too big for his little chest. One day, wandering this same riverbank, Sam had seen something rustling in the grass. A baby animal, maybe a squirrel, maybe something else. Caleb didn't remember clearly, but Sam did. Sam had crouched down, grinning, and said, "I'll name it Dottie, because its back has little white spots, just like the cookies Mom makes." That same evening, Sam slipped. Wet grass, a quick shout, a splash. By the time Caleb pulled him from the water, it was too late. And ever since that day, Caleb never named anything again. But now, saying Dottie again, even in a whisper, felt like pressing a hand against an old scar. Not sharp like pain, but tender, like something that never quite finished healing. In the front seat, Alden lifted his head slightly, just enough to look back through the mirror. His dark eyes found Caleb's just for a second, a quiet, knowing second. Caleb tightened his grip on the steering wheel, still silent, but he knew. This wasn't a coincidence. There was Alden always quiet, but always knowing more than he let on. There was Dottie, so small, so fragile, still holding on to breath like it was something worth fighting for. And then there was Caleb, a man who hadn't spoken a name with love in years, now whispering it like a prayer, letting it crack open a part of him that had been locked shut since the day the river took everything. And for the first time in a very long time, the silence inside him didn't feel hollow. It felt like the beginning of something. No one said a word. But in that old pickup truck, rolling slowly through the twilight woods, something had already begun. One man, one dog, one fawn. 3 lives, stitched together by something unspoken, were stepping into a new kind of story. Caleb pulled up in front of the small wooden house, where the scent of old timber and fireplace ash lived in the cracks between the bricks. He got out quietly, opened the back door, and lifted Dottie into his arms, holding her like a pillow that hadn't dried yet. Her fur was still damp. Ears drooped, legs tucked in close, like she was still afraid of touching the air. Inside, Caleb lit the fire. The wind slipped through the window cracks, stirring the smoke gently upward into pale ribbons against the ceiling. The room slowly warmed, but he still pulled the heavy blanket from the closet and laid it carefully near the hearth. He set Dottie down as if placing something delicate, something breakable, onto velvet. Then he knelt beside her, one knee to the floor, waiting. One breath, then another. Faint, but steady. Still here. Alden padded in behind them. He didn't bark, didn't wait for permission. He walked straight to Dottie, curled beside her, and pressed his side against her tiny frame. No movement after that, no shift, no sound, just presence. He stayed. Like that was the only job left in the world. Caleb eased down into the wooden chair by the fire. He leaned back, arms resting at his sides, eyes fixed on the 2 figures lying in front of him. The flames danced in the reflection of his eyes, casting back a light that hadn't lived there in years. Now and then, the fire cracked small pops that tossed flickers onto the walls, bending shadows into something that looked like they were breathing. And for a second, watching them there, Caleb wondered, who had really been saved today? Was it Dottie, the trembling little fawn, pulled from a river that nearly took her? Or was it him, the man who once swore he'd never bring another living thing into this house, not since he lost his wife, and then his son? Alden didn't move, didn't close his eyes. He just stayed there, warm and still. Dottie shifted slightly, curling tighter like a handful of dry grass pulled from wet earth. Her body flinched when the warmth reached her skin, like it had startled her back into being. Caleb's fingers trembled just a little. But it wasn't from fear. It was something else. Something warmer. Something unfamiliar. Like the first tiny crack in a wall of ice, not enough to collapse it, but just enough to let in a little light. Today he had said a name. Today he had let it live again. A name he once buried deep in a corner of memory too painful to touch. And now, in this quiet room that had forgotten the sound of life, he was watching a dog and a fawn sleep side by side, under the same roof that once held only silence. Maybe the one who'd been rescued wasn't Dottie. Maybe it wasn't even just Alden. Maybe for the first time in years it was him. Caleb Weiler. A man who once believed he had nothing left worth holding on to. Now sitting by a fire, heart cracked open just wide enough to feel the heat again. Inside the cabin that clung quietly to the hillside, The fireplace crackled softly in the corner. The flames licked at the stone wall, casting pale, flickering waves across the silver-gray bricks, like ripples on a still lake under moonlight. Caleb had laid Dottie down on a thick, folded blanket beside the fire. His old flannel coat, the one he always said he'd throw out but never did, was doubled up beneath her spine, soft against the sharpness of her bones. A thinner cloth rested gently over her chest, which still rose and fell with faint, uneven shivers from the cold. In the kitchen, the gas burner hummed quietly. A small pot of water trembled with soft bubbles, steam curling toward the wooden ceiling. Caleb leaned in, poured a bit of diluted milk into a battered tin cup, then carefully tipped some into its lid. He brought it over and placed it near Dottie's nose, not too close, not too far. Just enough for the scent to reach her tiny, twitching nostrils. She didn't move right away, didn't drink. Her ears stayed low, her neck curled in. She flinched slightly, pulling deeper into the folds of the blanket like something inside her still hadn't decided this place was safe. Her small legs curled tight. Her shoulders stiffened like survival had taught her that comfort was a trap. Caleb didn't say anything. He just sat down on the wooden stool near the stove, his back slightly hunched, hands clasped loosely in front of him. In the dim, shifting light, his face looked still, almost stern, but beneath it was something quiet unraveling. Not loud, not obvious, but real. He didn't reach out, didn't force it. He just sat and waited. A few feet away, Alden hadn't moved either. Since they stepped into the cabin, his eyes had never left the fawn. His gaze stayed fixed on the blanket, on that fragile creature who'd only just escaped the river's grip. Dottie glanced at him, just a flick of her eyes. But she saw him. Still, calm, steady. Then Alden stood, one step, then another, each movement deliberate and slow, no creeping, no sudden motions, just the quiet steps of an older brother not to frighten, but to say, "You're not alone." He passed Caleb without even looking, made his way to Dottie, and sat down in front of her, tall, composed. His tail swept the wooden floor in one slow arc, his paws aligned, his back straight, ears forward. And only then did Dottie lift her head again. She hesitated, then leaned forward. Her tongue brushed the edge of the lid. One drop of milk disappeared. Then another. There was no rush, no hunger like panic. Each sip was slow, deliberate, as if she was filling something deeper than her belly. Caleb didn't move, but his eyes, they softened. His breath eased out in a long, slow stream, like the air was warming from the inside. This wasn't the sound of old coffee dripping into a silent room. It wasn't the ticking of the clock on the wall. This was something else. The sound of a fawn drinking milk. Gentle, subtle, and completely new. He smiled. Barely, so small that even he didn't notice it at first. It drifted across his face like mist from the warm bowl, vanishing just as fast. But it had been there, real. And for the first time in what felt like forever, the kitchen smelled like warm milk. Not old coffee, not firewood, not dust. It smelled like life. Small. Simple. But enough to push back the cold that had settled too long in a man used to emptiness. Dottie still didn't come close to him. Even with the fire, even with the food, even with the blankets, she stayed tucked in corners, walking slow circles along the walls. She avoided Caleb's eyes like they were traps, like if she held his gaze too long, something in her would get caught, held, owned. Caleb didn't blame her. He wasn't surprised. For a creature pulled from cold water and dropped into a strange world, fear was natural. Distance was survival, and trust, that would come later. Maybe. He kept his distance. Just a few feet away, Caleb sat quietly and let the moment hold itself together. The old blanket lay folded by the hearth, undisturbed. The fire, now just embers and the occasional flicker, cast soft orange patterns across the wooden ceiling. On the wall, the silhouette of Dottie's small ears twitched at each unfamiliar sound, delicate and alert. Alden stayed where he was in the opposite corner, head resting on his front legs, eyes open, still watching. He hadn't looked away from Dottie once since they got home. Night fell quicker than usual. Caleb switched off the kitchen light, leaving just a single amber bulb glowing from the living room. He cracked the window open just a sliver, letting in a breath of cold mountain air. He'd done that for years, ever since his wife passed. Something about that crisp inhale made him feel present, still real, alive. He stood, stretching slow, and made his way over to check on Dottie one last time before heading to bed. But the blanket was empty. Caleb froze. Just a beat. Just long enough for something to stir in his chest. Then a few quiet steps later, he saw her. Dottie wasn't hiding in the corner anymore. She was lying next to Alden, not skittish, not tense. Her little head rested gently on Alden's front paw, her eyes half closed, drifting. Alden hadn't moved. Not a muscle. Only the rhythm of his breath gave him away. And a soft glance toward her, not startled, not annoyed, just aware. Caleb stood still. He didn't say a word. Didn't dare. There, in the softest light of the cabin, a dog and a fawn lay side by side. In a house that had once been nothing but shadows and wind, something had shifted. No one had told Dottie that Alden was safe. No one had told Alden to let her in. But somehow, without words, without rules, something between them had clicked into place, a quiet understanding, as old as the earth. And Caleb, the man who owned the house, the walls, the silence, could only watch from a few steps back. A guest in his own home. He let out a breath, long and low. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was because, for the first time in years, he was witnessing something close to trust, that foreign, distant thing he hadn't let himself believe in anymore. Dawn crept in without fanfare. A thin silver light slid through the window, touching the edge of the wooden wall and draping the room in that kind of early morning calm only mountain folk know, the kind that hums through your ribs before the world wakes up. The fireplace still glowed faintly, the coals low but alive. Their dim warmth threw long shadows across the floor, slow-moving and soft like the breath of someone dreaming. Caleb was still there, still in that crooked wooden chair with the warped armrest, the same one he'd sat in for years, drinking cold coffee and staring into nothing. But now his eyes were closed. His breathing was slow, steady. Sleep had come without warning, like slipping on smooth gravel after a long uphill walk. Gentle, silent, undeniable. And when he opened them again, the first thing he saw wasn't the wall, wasn't the table, wasn't the empty cup. It was Dottie, curled up beside Alden, sound asleep. Her tiny body pressed into his side, rising and falling with every breath. Her head rested right at the bend of his leg, tucked into the warm crook of his paw, a position no creature would ever take unless they felt completely safe. Caleb didn't move. He didn't need to. He just watched and let himself feel it. Those weathered eyes, the ones that had seen too many goodbyes, now settled on a moment that didn't ask for anything, but still gave everything. A wild little fawn, an old soul in a shepherd's body, and a man who had sealed himself off for far too long. No one said a word, yet the room felt full, like it was breathing again, like silence had its own kind of music, soft, slow, and laced with something that felt an awful lot like healing. Caleb rose slowly. The floor creaked under his weight, but it didn't wake them. Not even a twitch. He stepped forward, cautious, like the piece in front of him might shatter if he got too close too fast. He lowered himself to his knees, right there beside them. His hand lifted, paused mid-air. Not from fear, but reverence, like his fingers had forgotten how to touch something gentle. Then, finally, he laid his hand on Dottie's head. Just barely. A whisper of contact. The kind of touch that asks permission even as it's happening. She didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't open her eyes. She just kept sleeping. Like that touch had always belonged there. Caleb turned his face to the side, away from the firelight. His jaw clenched gently. He bit down on his bottom lip just enough to hold something in. Not tears exactly, but a kind of ache that felt like thawing. Like something frozen inside him had cracked open just enough to let light in. Not grief, not joy. Just the quiet release that happens when you stop holding yourself together. He stood, took a few steps back, and stopped at the edge of the living room. Dawn was stretching its fingers across the floorboards now, warm and pale. It reached the tips of Alden's paws, brushed along Dottie's back. Caleb looked at them. A dog and a deer. Two lives that should have never met yet, here they were, asleep beside each other like they'd belonged to this house all along. Then, softly, he whispered not to them. Maybe not even to the room, maybe just to whatever part of himself still needed to hear it. If my boy were alive, he'd be about that age now. The words fell into the hush, catching on the crackle of the fire. Caleb leaned back into the old chair, closed his eyes for a breath. But something pulled at him, a quiet shift in the air. He opened his eyes again. Something wasn't right. He didn't hear Alden's steady breathing anymore, or the soft scratch of paws shifting on the floor. A strange stillness filled the space, like someone had quietly stepped out and taken the warmth with them. Caleb stood, turned on the lamp. Its soft glow spilled gently across the room. The blanket by the fireplace was empty. No Dottie, no Alden. His feet found the center of the room. Every step landed a little heavier than the last. The soles of his slippers brushed against old wood, whispering just enough to stir the silence. His heart beat faster. Wind moaned against the eaves. A faint shaft of dawnlight angled through the kitchen window, casting a faint line across the hallway. And that's where he stopped. At the threshold. Because right there, something waited. Through the misted kitchen window, Caleb saw her. Dottie was curled up tightly beneath the sill, pressed close to the cold wall. Her wide eyes stayed fixed on the night outside, as if she were afraid to miss even the smallest whisper from the forest beyond. Every time the wind howled through the cracks in the cabin, her tiny ears twitched. With each gust, her fragile body tensed. But she never moved from that spot. The porch light spilled through the frosted glass, catching her eyes in a soft shimmer. And from where Caleb stood, those eyes looked like they were holding something unspoken, something delicate and deep. And then he saw Alden. The old German shepherd was outside. Not at the fireplace, not in his usual spot by the door, but on the porch in the freezing cold, sitting directly across from Dottie just beyond the glass. His back was to the wind. His eyes were locked on hers. He didn't move, didn't bark, didn't paw at the door. He just sat there, like a silent wall, a shield between the wild wind and the little soul trembling inside. Dottie didn't look away. She didn't hide. She didn't curl deeper into the shadows. She simply stayed right there, watching him. And somehow, that was enough. It was like just knowing Alden was there made the darkness outside a little less terrifying. Minutes passed. Maybe more. Then Alden shifted slowly, like time itself had asked permission. He lay down right by the door, his head resting near the base of the glass. His eyes didn't close. He kept watch. The wind howled across the porch, dragging dry leaves across the floorboards. But Alden didn't flinch. He didn't leave. He stayed whole and quiet. And Caleb, he didn't call him back. He didn't open the door. He just stood in the dark, one hand buried deep in his pocket, the other resting on the counter, eyes blurry behind the misted pain. Because what he was witnessing wasn't instinct. It was presence. A quiet vow that didn't need to be spoken. I'm here. You don't have to face the night alone. And in that stillness, that silent bridge between a house and a porch, between a fawn and a dog, something inside Caleb settled. He didn't step closer. He didn't speak. He just watched. Because this was trust, not his, but theirs, formed not through commands or familiarity, but through simply being there, through choosing to stay. Outside, Dottie's back glowed faintly in the porch light. Her small form curled tighter against the glass, her breath fogging the lower corner of the window with each shallow exhale. Her ears flicked with the wind, but her eyes remained on Alden, a silent connection that didn't need words. The forest behind the house felt like it was holding its breath. No owls, no insects, not even a rustle from the trees, just the sound of dead leaves brushing across the porch and the fragile rise and fall of Dottie's chest. Then, from the hallway came movement. Not sudden, not loud, just quiet footsteps, soft enough to feel like part of the room. And then Alden was inside. No bark, no scratching. He appeared like the dark itself had shaped into a shepherd and decided to come home. Quiet, steady, like he'd been there all along. Alden didn't look at Caleb, didn't veer off like he sometimes did, as if giving the old man space. Number. This time, Alden walked straight toward her. No hesitation, no sound. He stopped right beside Dottie. For a moment, he simply stood there, head slightly tilted, watching her. Then, without a single cue or glance elsewhere, Alden slowly lowered his body to the floor. His back pressed against the wall, placing himself between Dottie and the draft that slipped under the cabin door. He became a warm, living one. Dottie didn't flinch, didn't pull away. Instead, her tiny frame began to relax, like something inside her recognized the gesture not with words, but with the part of her spirit that remembered safety. Slowly, she shifted. Just a little. Just enough to lean into that new shelter. No panic, no pause. Just trust. Alden stayed perfectly still, eyes open, facing the woods, his gaze locked on the darkness outside like he was telling the night itself, not here, not tonight, not while I'm breathing. Dottie let her head fall gently against Alden's front paw. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. No one had to teach them this, no command was spoken. But in that sliver of silence, two souls, one trembling from a second chance at life, the other weathered by years of loyalty and loss, found each other. On the coldest night of winter, in the warmest corner of the room, Caleb stood in the shadowed hallway, one hand resting over his chest. His heart had just skipped, not from shock, not from grief, but from something else entirely. Something that made him feel small, in the presence of something sacred. He didn't know what to call it, didn't dare name it. But he knew this much: it didn't come from man. Caleb slowly turned away, heading for the living room. But just before he disappeared into the dark, he looked back. The porch light still glowed faintly through the glass, casting a soft beam across Alden's fur. It looked like a golden wall, gentle and solid, wrapped around them both. And within that wall, Dottie had closed her eyes, breathing steady, safe, asleep, for the first time since the river. Caleb stood still at the threshold. He didn't speak, didn't move, just breathed long and deep like someone afraid to wake a moment that wasn't meant to last. He couldn't remember the last time he'd seen something this tender. Maybe it had been years, maybe never. Then, slowly, he stepped back not to leave, but to hold the whole scene in view, to take in every line, every shadow, every whisper of warmth. His hand reached for the drawer near the table. Inside was a relic, an old phone cracked screen, almost always dead. Forgotten for so long it had become part of the wood. He powered it on. The screen flickered, buzzed, struggled, then lit up. The camera still worked. Caleb raised it gently, carefully, like he was touching a scar that had never quite healed. He didn't adjust the settings, didn't aim for the perfect shot. He just let it be, as it was, exactly as it was meant to be. In the frame, Dottie lay curled beside Alden. Their shadows stretched long across the worn wooden floor. Behind them, the window was fogged with breath and cold, but just enough porch light spilled through to trace the soft outlines of life. Small, fragile, but unmistakably alive. A soft click broke the silence. Quiet. Barely there. No one flinched, no one stirred. Caleb lowered the phone. The screen glowed dimly, showing the photo a little blurred, colors cooled by the room's hush. But the feeling in it was undeniable. Raw. True. The kind that doesn't need sharp focus to be clear. His hand closed gently around the phone. It had been so long since he held a picture that wasn't from the past. So long since it captured something still breathing, something still becoming. Maybe something that might stay. He saved the photo. Didn't name it. Didn't tag the moment. Just let it sit there. Quiet and full. But a few seconds later, his finger drifted to the little notes bar beneath the image. And for reasons he couldn't explain, not even to himself, he typed a few words. Slowly. Carefully. Like writing a letter not to the world, but to the quietest part of himself. Nightwind, a fawn, a guardian, and something coming back. He didn't know what that something was. Maybe it was trust, maybe it was the feeling of being needed again. Or maybe it was just a reason, a small, stubborn reason, to not feel so empty when the sky turned dark. He turned off the screen, slipped the phone back into the drawer. Then he turned toward the fire, sat down again in the old wooden chair beside the hearth. Didn't say a word. Didn't need to. His eyes found Dottie, still fast asleep, and Alden still watching, still guarding. His eyes half closed, but never unaware. The fire crackled softly in the background. The wind kept pressing against the windows. But tonight, in that little wooden house at the edge of the forest, something had shifted. Something had changed. And it didn't need a name. Morning came soft and slow. The first rays of sunlight spilled over the treetops, brushing the backyard with a light gold mist. Caleb opened the back door, coffee steaming in his hand, and stepped onto the porch. The air was cold enough to bite, but he barely noticed. What he was waiting for was already out there. Alden moved first. No signal, no rush, just the same steady ritual he'd kept for years. He walked the yard with purpose, nose low, tail even, tracing familiar trails across the grass. Around the stump, near the fence post, then back again. Every movement deliberate, like music written into his bones from all those years of training. No one told him to do it. He just did. That's how Alden greeted every morning, by remembering who he was. Dottie lingered at the top step. Her front hooves tapped the wood once, then stilled. She tilted her head, ears flicking at the wind, as if the air itself was unfamiliar. She took one step forward, then paused. The porch was safety. The grass was too open, too big. She didn't move again. Caleb didn't speak, didn't urge her on. He just sat on the porch chair, mug warming his hands, eyes watching the way the world breathed in front of him. Alden was looping back, calm as ever, and Dottie, still frozen on the edge, caught something in the way he moved. Maybe it was how his feet brushed the grass, or how his body curved with the wind. Whatever it was, it drew her. She stepped down. One hoof, then the next. Stopped, then took another. Not fast, not fearless, but forward. Alden didn't turn around. He didn't need to. He simply slowed down, just enough. Dottie followed. Not close, not far, but in the same direction. That was enough. Caleb took a sip of coffee. It wasn't hot anymore, but the bitterness had softened. He watched them, one large, one small, the morning light, stretching their shadows side by side across the damp grass. There were no commands, no pressure, no signs exchanged. But they moved as if they'd always been meant to. Every day since she'd arrived, Dottie had been watching. She never walked far, only a few steps from the porch, then back again. But her eyes, they always followed Alden, like he was the only map that made sense. And Alden never once looked back, but he always slowed, as if he could feel the tiny breath behind him, trying to catch up. This wasn't a chase, it wasn't training, it was something softer, something that didn't need names. Caleb sat still, not wanting to disturb what was unfolding. The sun lit the tops of the trees, and the grass glistened with the last of the morning dew. Dottie moved like she was remembering something her body hadn't learned yet. Alden moved like he was making space for her to try. Then one morning, it happened. They ran, side by side. Not in sync, not perfectly, but together. Dottie's legs kicked a little higher, clumsy but determined. Alden kept his stride even, steady. Between them stretched a space, a shared rhythm wide enough to breathe, close enough to matter. They weren't chasing anything. They weren't being chased. They were just alive, and they were learning how to be alive together. Caleb stood on the porch, coffee forgotten in his hand, a breath caught somewhere deep in his chest. He didn't smile. Not really. But something inside him softened and stayed warm, even as the wind began to stir the trees again. And Caleb thought, maybe this is how the broken find each other again, not through words, but through footsteps heading the same way. He drew in a deep breath. The morning air carried the scent of damp earth and fresh grass, soaked in the quiet stillness of a world just waking up. And something inside Caleb, something he thought had gone silent, began to stir again. Because sometimes you don't need someone to keep your pace. You just need someone willing to slow down and wait. Caleb stood at the edge of the wooden porch, fingers gently brushing the doorframe. The breeze slipped through his flannel shirt, cool against his skin, laced with the smell of wet leaves and softened soil. The coffee in his hand had long since gone cold, but he hadn't touched it. Out there were Alden and Dottie. Alden was doing what he always did. Same path, same rhythm, circling the yard with that quiet discipline that never fully left him. But this time, something had changed. Dottie wasn't just watching. She was moving, Not quickly, not smoothly, but moving. Caleb's brow furrowed slightly. He wasn't sure if he should follow. It had been so long since he'd stepped barefoot into a dew-soaked morning. So long since he'd walked this yard with any sense of purpose. But something nudged him. He crouched slowly, set the cold coffee down on the wooden step, took a breath, and stepped into the grass. The chill kissed his heels first, sharp, clean, bracing. But it was real, and that was something. Caleb straightened his back and walked, not fast, not slow, just enough. Enough to feel it, enough to close the distance. Ahead, Alden didn't look back, but his gait stretched wider, giving space. Dottie paused, turned her head, then kept going. Caleb said nothing, didn't smile. He simply walked, steady and quiet, matching their pace as best he could without disturbing the fragile shape of the moment. A man, a German shepherd, a baby deer still learning how to stand her ground. 3 rhythms not the same, but somehow in tune. They didn't march. They didn't run. They just moved. A quiet loop around the yard Caleb had once believed would never hold life again. And somewhere between the first turn and the second, Caleb let out a long, slow breath. Not from exhaustion, but from something deeper. Something was loosening in his chest. A memory. A scar, a frozen thread of feeling he thought had gone numb for good. But here it was. Melting. Gently. Completely. In the soft hush of a new morning. When they made it back to the porch, Alden had stopped. Dottie stood beside him. They didn't advance. They didn't retreat. They just waited. No signal, no gesture. But the waiting said it all. And Caleb understood he hadn't walked that path alone. Not today, not anymore. He bent down, rested his hand on Alden's head, then gently brushed his palm along Dottie's slender back. Just a touch. Just one breath. A moment so ordinary, and yet it held enough warmth to make him feel less alone. In that quiet yard, with the sun rising higher, golden light spilled across the grass. The chill faded, and inside Caleb's chest, a single word surfaced. Soft, unspoken, but certain. Family. He stood on the porch, coffee still faintly warm in his hand, watching the 2 figures walking ahead, one large, one small, moving along the narrow path that curved past the backyard fence. It was the same path that led to Elma's place. Old Elma, his neighbor, from 3 doors down. The one who always wore wool cardigans and smelled like dried lavender and lemon balm. Caleb still walked over every Friday to help her tend that scrappy garden out back, the one filled with daisies, dry moss, and weeds she refused to pull. Alden walked ahead with steady steps, not rushing, as if he remembered every knot in every route along the way. Dottie ran forward, then stopped, looked back, waited. Sometimes she'd fall into step beside Alden. Other times she'd bound ahead, but never far, never out of sight. The trail cut through a pair of aging pines. Dry leaves crunched beneath their feet, whispering like old ghosts. Sunlight spilled through the trees in soft flickers, casting golden freckles across the dirt. Caleb wore his old flannel, the same faded red and black he always grabbed, when the morning-turned brisk shovel slung in one hand, the other tucked into his coat pocket. A worn wooden toothpick rested between his teeth, like it always had on these quiet walks. Like every Friday, there were no words. He just followed. Let Alden and Dottie lead because something in him trusted their direction more than his own. Soon they reached the old gate in front of Elma's yard. Everything looked just as it always did. The creaky rattan chair still sat by the porch. Her long wool shawl hung on its usual hook by the door, swaying gently in the breeze. Caleb paused to unlatch the wooden gate. It squealed open like an old friend waking from sleep. Alden and Dottie stepped in first, their feet making soft sounds on the packed dirt path. They didn't need instructions, just like always. They took a few rounds through the yard, sniffing, mapping, remembering. Dottie veered toward the back garden near the crumbling pig pen, where Elma kept a patch of wildflowers fenced in by crooked stones. Caleb turned to loop the shovel onto the branch he always used. Then, woof! A sharp bark cracked the silence, then two more, quick, urgent, not play, not confusion. Caleb spun around. Alden was less than 10 feet from the old pig pen, body rigid, ears flattened, eyes locked ahead. A low growl pulsed from deep in his chest. Dottie stood frozen beside him, her legs braced, nose pointed to the ground, ears standing like little arrows. The air turned heavy. Still. Electric. Caleb dropped the shovel without thinking. The clang hit the ground behind him, but he was already running boots thudding hard over grass and soil. His gut twisted. That cold whisper down his spine wasn't just a shiver. Something wasn't right, and every step he took made that certainty grow louder. Early morning. The backyard of the little cabin was wrapped in that kind of calm only found at dawn, where the wind moved slow, the trees breathed quiet, and every blade of grass glistened with dew. Normally, that calm would be interrupted by the soft rhythm of paws brushing over earth, by the joyful dance of footsteps, a dog and a deer playing tag through the fog. But not today. Caleb stood at the porch, coffee still steaming in his hand. Something felt off. He couldn't quite name it, but he felt it in his bones. There was no gentle bark as Alden chased shadows beneath the oak. No scamper of hooves trying to keep up. No Dottie. Dottie wasn't chasing anything this morning. She stood at the far edge of the yard, right at the invisible line where Caleb's world ended and the wild began. Past the last row of trees, past the fence no one ever fixed. Still. Head tilted. Ears pointed toward the forest like antennae. Not afraid, not restless, just listening. As if something out there was calling her something only she could hear. A heartbeat maybe, a whisper, or just that old primal pull. Caleb placed his mug down, rested his hand on the porch railing. He didn't blink. She stayed like that for a long time. And the next morning, it happened again. Dottie stepped outside, bypassed the familiar path she once shared with Alden, and walked straight to the trees. Stopped, watched, waited, smelled. Sometimes she'd shift a few inches closer. But she never crossed. It wasn't a fluke. It wasn't curiosity. It was something deeper, like instinct was waking up. And Alden he didn't run like before either. He no longer tried to play, no longer nudged Dottie's side with his nose, urging her to come join the chase. He stayed back, close but not in the way. And when Dottie stood at the edge of the forest, Alden stopped too, watching, guarding. As if he knew something sacred was happening, something that didn't need interference, only respect, only silence. Caleb watched them both, and in his chest something tightened gently, like the hush before a storm that never comes. It wasn't fear, it wasn't sadness either. It was the feeling you get when you know something's about to change, not in a loud, breaking way, but like snow melting quietly under the first breath of spring. He whispered it to himself, not out loud, just under his breath, like you do when you're scared to admit a truth. She's going to leave. But this time, it wasn't like before. Not like when his daughter left and never came back. Not like the day he buried a wedding ring beneath the pine and stood there long after the last shovelful of earth. This wasn't a loss. This felt like a return. Dottie was no longer the fragile thing they'd pulled from the stream, no longer that trembling shadow hiding behind the stove. Now her eyes were clear. Her legs carried her with confidence. She didn't just survive, she grew. She remembered how to belong to the world she came from. And Caleb, for all the grief, all the goodbyes, felt something else rise up this time. Not sorrow, but gratitude. Because he'd been given a gift not everyone gets. He got to witness it, all of it. From the first shiver to the quiet strength, moment by moment. And he knew the goodbye was coming. Not today, not yet, but soon. Each movement, each tiny change, quiet but deep like the shift of a season. You don't see it coming, but you feel it in your bones. And Alden, the silent, loyal sentinel, was always there, never in the way, never holding Dottie back, just present, watching, guarding, waiting, the same way Caleb once stood by Alden years ago. And now both of them were learning something no one ever teaches you, when to hold on and when to let go. That morning, Caleb knew. It was time to start preparing. But he didn't rush, because Dottie was still there, still within the yard, still choosing to stay. And sometimes just one more day is the greatest gift of all. That afternoon, the sun came soft, gentle enough to soak into the old wood of the porch and spill across the patchy grass. Caleb opened the back door, a small porcelain dish in hand, with a few thin slices of apple neatly placed. He walked slowly, boots leaving prints in the softened dirt, and sat down on the familiar step saying nothing, letting the breeze and sunlight do the talking. In the middle of the yard, Dottie lay curled up, her back pressed against Alden's belly. A little hill of breath rising and falling. Still. Warm. Safe. Alden didn't move. He just rested his chin on his front paws, eyes half closed like he was standing guard over a dream that didn't belong to him. Caleb set the apple dish down. Not too close, not too far. He didn't call out, didn't coax. He just waited. Dottie watched, but stayed still. Not until Alden lifted his head, padded forward, and took a bite did Dottie slowly rise. Her legs moved with a gentleness that almost seemed sacred, like any sudden gesture might break the fragile peace wrapped around them all. Then she stepped towards the plate and ate a slice. Then another. Slow, deliberate, but always with one eye glancing toward Caleb. He smiled. Not a wide grin, not a proud one, just a soft pull at the corner of his mouth because he saw it. Dottie wasn't afraid of him anymore. She wasn't flinching, she wasn't hiding. But she still only felt completely safe. When Alden was near. A bridge, a translator, a steady back to lean on. Caleb brushed his worn shirt sleeve against his palm, then eased himself all the way down into the dirt. Cold seeped through the fabric of his pants, but he didn't mind. The wind slipped past the porch roof and ran across his shoulder, carrying his voice, gravelly, slow but warm, into the air. We made it here, each in our own way, but we all found our way back. No one replied. But the way Alden settled back down beside the apple dish, and the way Dottie shifted just a few inches closer to Caleb, filled the space between them with something more than silence. Something alive. It was like another presence had quietly stepped into the yard, not a person, not a sound, just a feeling. A feeling that said, "We belong." Caleb let out a long breath, set his hand gently on his knee, and watched the two creatures before him. One dog, one deer somehow completing a picture he thought he had lost forever. And then, unexpectedly, his mind wandered to the old dining table inside. No one had sat around that table in years. So many meals eaten alone, So many nights spent listening to the echo of his own fork against the plate. But right now, in this yard, Caleb felt like he was sitting at a table again, not alone, but with family. That night, when he lay down in bed and rested his head on the same flattened pillow he'd used for a decade, Caleb didn't expect to dream. But sometimes when the heart is full, sleep doesn't just come. It arrives bearing stories the soul still wants to tell. But in the dream, Caleb found himself in a sunlit forest. Leaves shimmered in the wind, and a silk-thin mist slid low across the ground like a ribbon pulled by invisible hands. Then, from the far edge of that stillness, came a call, Dottie's voice. But not as the tiny, trembling creature he first rescued. She wasn't curled up beside anyone. She wasn't waiting to be held. Dottie stood tall, alone, in the center of the clearing, on her own legs, calling back, not in fear, but in invitation, as if she was waiting for someone to follow her home. When Caleb woke, the light had shifted. Sun poured through the window, painting his bedroom in soft gold. The dream still hung in the corners of his mind, strangely clear, like it had happened not while he slept, but while he simply closed his eyes to remember. He didn't try to hold on to it. He just breathed out slowly and stood. When he opened the back door, there she was. Dottie, standing exactly where the forest began. Still, not looking back. Her neck stretched forward, ears alert, eyes fixed on the woods, those thick, knotted trees that swallowed the morning sun like they understood its language better than any living thing. The wind tugged through the clearing, and the fur along Dottie's spine quivered like young grass just learning to stand. Behind her, a few steps away, sat Alden, silent, still. Alden didn't call out, didn't approach. He just waited, like a companion who knew there were some journeys you didn't interrupt. Only witness, only honor. Caleb said nothing. He stayed on the porch, the wooden steps cold beneath his bare feet. And in that fragile hush, time seemed to pause. Caleb looked down at his own hands, weathered, thinned by age and years of holding on too tightly to things that were never meant to stay. And that's when it came to him, a sentence soft as breath. You can't hold on to what belongs to the wild. Dottie didn't turn around. She didn't need to, because something in the way she stood, quiet, focused, wholly still, told Caleb everything he needed to know. It was time. No push, no pull, just a knowing. Caleb gave a small nod. To no one in particular, but inside, he knew what that nod meant. He had made a decision. Not as a rescuer, not as a man clinging to what gave him comfort, but as a father learning how and when to let go. He would take Dottie home, not to abandon her, but to return her, to let her walk back into the place her bones remembered, where roots ran deep, where wind carried the scent of ancestors, and where her spirit had been quietly pulling her all along. But she wouldn't go alone, and neither would he, because some journeys aren't meant for one set of footsteps. They require 3, Caleb, Dottie, and Alden. A man who once forgot how to live in the light, a dog who had given his whole life to service and quiet loyalty, and a deer born of the wild but raised by love. 3 hearts, 3 paths, bound for a forest waiting to receive them all. He looked at them both. Alden had already stepped forward, just one quiet step closer to Dottie, a silent confirmation that no one needed to say aloud. And Dottie, still facing the forest, had finally stopped holding her breath, as if all she'd been waiting for was that one presence behind her, that one familiar shadow. Caleb stepped down from the porch. The morning breeze felt lighter than usual, gentler somehow, like it too knew what was coming. And in that moment, with sunlight pouring over the pale wood and stretching long across the yard, Caleb felt it clearly. A new chapter was beginning. He sat in the worn chair by the railing. In his hand was a weathered, leather-bound notebook. For years it had held only sketches, a few scattered names, and memories that no longer spoke to anyone but him. Then Caleb stood and walked back inside. He opened the drawer beneath the old kitchen table, one that hadn't been moved in years, and pulled out a crumpled map. The folds were deep, frayed at the creases, and its colors had faded to dusty shades. But the red ink was still there. A map of the Northern National Forest, marked in red from another lifetime, a lifetime of tracking deer through snowbanks, of mapping their paths from watering holes to hidden valleys. Back when a friend of his in Forest Service used to send him tips, Caleb would mark every whispered route on paper like sacred trails meant for return. This time he didn't look for signs to follow. He circled places to return to. Caleb smoothed the paper down on the table. He reached for a red pencil, then paused just for a second before he began to draw the first loop. Not for pursuit, for release. Below the table, Dottie had quietly curled up by his boots. Her small head rested gently on her front hooves, her ears alert, eyes locked on the map above. Occasionally, her ears twitched as if something old and familiar was waking inside her. Some memory of open land, of streams and cedar. Caleb paused his hand, looked down. Dottie didn't move. But in her gaze, he saw it, that she knew. That map, with its softened folds and faded ink, wasn't for Caleb. It was for her. By the window, Alden lay on his side, his body long and relaxed, eyes half closed. But his ears kept moving, just slightly, every time the chair creaked, or Caleb murmured something under his breath. Alden didn't need to see. He was already tuned in. A sentinel at rest, but never off duty. Caleb drew a small circle near Pine Creek, a quiet spot where he once saw a herd slip through the fog like ghosts. Then another, farther off, near the Cedar Ridge drop-off. He had never walked that path, only heard stories of does bringing their young there when spring softened the cliffs. Each circle meant something. A question, a memory, a promise. "We don't know exactly where we're going," Caleb said softly, the words low and steady, spoken into the quiet kitchen as much as into his own chest. "But we'll get there. Together." No one wrote that vow down. No witness signed it. But in Dottie's wide, watchful eyes, and in the soft flick of Alden's ear at the sound of Caleb's voice, he knew it had been heard. 3 heartbeats. 3 rhythms in sync. No destination yet, no timeline, but a direction. A journey is about to begin. Caleb folded the map gently, like it was something sacred, not paper. He ran his hand down a softened crease, then turned to look at the 2 lives that had remade his house into a home. A dog, a deer, a man, and a silent promise not needing a single signature, because it would be kept, completely, and with all the heart he had left. That morning, just as Caleb was tightening the last strap on the old canvas bag in the truck bed, a familiar voice floated softly from behind the wooden fence. "Mr. Caleb." It was Elma, wrapped in a dark knit sweater, a scarf looped around her neck, and carrying a weathered wicker basket. Her steps were slow and careful, but her smile was warm enough to light the whole yard. "Don't tell me you're planning to work the garden again," Caleb teased as he stood. "Number not today." She lifted the basket slightly. "Just thought I'd bring something over." She approached and held it out. A few leftover plums, some apples, and this. From inside the basket, Elma pulled out a small note, folded neatly in quarters. The paper was old, its edges soft from time, but the handwriting was clear. A little shaky, but unmistakably hers. Caleb took it gently and unfolded it. Caleb, I've never been good with words, so please don't laugh. This morning, while I was sipping tea on the porch, I realized something. I'm still alive. And maybe that sounds simple, but it isn't. If it hadn't been for you, for Alden, and that little deer, I might not be here writing this. 3 beings, a man, a dog, and a deer, didn't say a word. But somehow, quietly, you saved me. I've packed some apples and dried plums. Take them along. If you pass by again, I'll pick more. I hope this journey you're about to take goes and gently. The way it all began. Elma. Caleb read it slowly. When he finished, he folded the letter back with care, tucking it into the inside pocket of his flannel, the same place he used to carry an old photo of his family. His hand paused there for a second, thumb brushing the edge of the paper like it held something sacred. Alden wandered over and sniffed the edge of the basket. Elma laughed and leaned down to pat his head. You take good care of them now, Alden. You hear? Dottie stood quietly at the edge of the yard. She didn't move closer, but her ears tilted back ever so slightly. Her gaze lingered on the old woman. No bark, no sound, just recognition. Familiar. Gentle. Caleb pulled the truck door open. Alden hopped in first, settling into his usual spot at the left side of the truck bed like he had a designated seat. Dottie circled once, then climbed up beside him, curling in close, side pressed to side. Caleb climbed into the cab, buckled the worn seat belt, and started the engine. The old truck rumbled to life with a low, steady hum, soft and calm, like a deep breath breaking the dawn. The pickup eased onto the narrow dirt path. Tall grass brushed both sides, and the sun filtered through the trees in fractured golden shafts. A man, a dog, a deer. 3 lives, 3 rhythms, beginning something new. From her porch, Elma stood watching them go. She didn't wave. She just held one hand in the air, high and still, as if sending something invisible with it. And ahead, the forest waited. The road wasn't paved. Rocks jutted out, roots tangled beneath the surface. Deep tracks from old tires cut into the hardened spring dirt, marking the way forward. But no one complained. No one hesitated. Because sometimes the most important journeys aren't about where you're going. They're about who's beside you, when you begin. Under the weight of time, his body may have slowed, but Caleb's eyes stayed clear. Still looking forward. Toward the thinning sunlight, slipping gently between the treetops ahead. In the back seat, Dottie sat close to the window, her nose gently pressed to the glass. Every time the truck paused, even briefly, Dottie leaned in closer, sniffing the air with quiet intent, like she was listening to something that couldn't be heard. Not sound, but scent. Wind. The soft trace of a herd that had once passed this way. Something only she could understand. Alden followed behind her, silent and steady. He never pushed ahead. Never rushed. But he kept close enough to protect, and far enough to let Dottie walk on her own terms. His gaze swept each side of the road like an old habit, alert and watchful, like guarding a mission that was never spoken aloud. After more than an hour, Caleb pulled the truck to a stop near the forest's edge, where the trail narrowed too tightly for wheels to go further. He stepped out slowly and opened the back hatch. Dottie was first to leap down light, cautious and graceful. Then Alden, sturdy and precise, landed without a sound. From here on, they walked. The forest path grew narrow. Branches brushed against Caleb's flannel sleeves. Dewy grass clung to the hem of his pants. He didn't lead, but he wasn't left behind either, They moved together in 3 rhythms, never perfectly in sync, but never drifting apart. At a wide old tree with roots like open hands, Caleb paused. His fingers reached into the breast pocket of his coat, touching the fold of Elma's letter. He pulled it halfway out. Didn't read it, just looked. A long, steady look, then folded it again. Slow, careful, like tucking away something sacred. He didn't need to read it anymore, because by now, Caleb understood what was pulling them forward wasn't logic. It wasn't planning. It was something deeper, something wordless, a responsibility to life itself. Dottie walked ahead now, not hesitating as much. Her steps had purpose, and behind her, Alden scanned the path, pausing now and then to glance at Caleb. Not out of concern. Just checking. Is your pace all right? Are you still with us? 3 beings, 3 pasts, each forged in a different kind of fire. A man who had once given up, a dog trained for sacrifice, and a young deer pulled from death's grip by hands that didn't expect to hold hope again. Now they shared the same path. No one hurried, but no one stopped either. Caleb glanced down at the trail beneath his boots. One set of prints was small and light, one broad and confident, one deep and slow, pressed down by years. He smiled to himself, whispered like confessing to the wind. Some promises don't need to be said out loud. You just walk, and by walking together you keep them. That morning, the sun hadn't yet pierced through the delicate veil of mist blanketing the roots of the old pines. The air was cool and damp, but strangely gentle, like the forest was holding its breath, quietly bracing for something sacred. Dottie stood still, head tilted ever so slightly. Even the faintest rustle among the leaves made her ears flick upright, eyes glinting with a brightness Caleb hadn't seen before. He almost stepped forward, but stopped, because something in the air had shifted. It wasn't the sound, it was the scent, a trace on the wind, maybe left behind by a herd that once passed through, or perhaps one figure Dottie had never truly forgotten. Dottie began to walk, not with hesitation, not waiting for a signal, just a few small steps, quiet, certain. No one called her forward, no one gave a command. It was instinct, raw and undisturbed, pulling her ahead like an invisible thread woven into the trees. Alden stayed behind. He didn't bark, didn't move to follow right away. He just watched his gaze deep and unwavering. He didn't crowd her. He never had. Always close enough to protect, but far enough to give Dottie space to find her own footing. Caleb gripped the strap of his backpack. He knew now. This wasn't just a journey to return a young animal to the wild. It had become something else, something far more intimate. A return not to a place, but to self, to memory, to something that had been waiting quietly all along. Dottie weaved through the narrow forest paths, her hooves brushing against dry grass, shoulders brushing dew from the leaves. But she didn't stop. Her eyes, no longer the uncertain gaze of a fragile creature, held a clarity that could only come from knowing where one truly belonged. Then, it happened. In a clearing streaked with fractured sunlight, a figure emerged. A doe. Larger than Dottie, lean. Her coat was darker, aged by time and weather. She stood perfectly still. Dottie froze. She didn't bolt, she didn't run forward. She just looked. Her ears quivered, her nose twitched with cautious recognition, her eyes wide not with fear, but realization. Caleb stopped breathing. His hand instinctively rested on Alden's shoulder, anchoring him in that electric stillness. No words passed, no sounds stirred, but between Dottie and the doe, something ancient was being spoken. Something beyond language, beyond logic, pure animal memory. Alden stood like a sentinel, his posture relaxed, almost reverent. He didn't scan the woods anymore. His watchful eyes were now soft, still as if guarding the quiet reunion before them, making sure it unfolded just as it was meant to. Caleb's grip on his pack tightened. A long breath escaped him, slow and steady. In his chest, something settled. Something old. Something aching. Dottie was walking the right path, her path, and sometimes the best thing a grown man can do is simply step aside and let the miracle happen. So Caleb stayed where he was. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He raised a hand gently, signaling Alden without a word. Let her go. Dottie moved forward. Not fast but deliberate. Her hooves pressed into the leaf-littered earth, leaving faint prints edged in mist. Her tail is low, her head dipped in instinctive humility, but her steps, they never wavered. The doe remained motionless, waiting, like she had always been waiting. The wind stirred through the canopy, brushing against their ears, one set large and worn, the other smaller, still learning. No calls, no signs. But Dottie walked as if guided by some long-lost melody only she could hear, a song that lived in her bones. And then, finally, they stood face to face, a young deer marked by pain, softened by care, an older doe worn thin by time, yet still standing. And in that moment between them, something clicked into place, like a bone finding its joint, like a soul remembering where it belongs. Caleb's eyes filled, but he didn't blink. Because that was the soundless truth he'd been carrying without knowing. Sometimes love means leading someone home, just far enough to let them walk the rest alone. Caleb swallowed hard. His hand found Alden's shoulder, steadying himself as much as the dog. Everything around them had gone so silent that Caleb could hear his own heartbeat pounding inside the hush. And then, bang! The gunshot ripped through the forest like a blade slicing a crescendo in half. Sharp, sudden, brutal. The doe collapsed. No cry, no struggle, just the heavy final thud of a body hitting damp earth in the same place that just seconds earlier had felt like a sacred homecoming. Dottie froze. Her whole body trembled, eyes wide, neck stretching forward instinctively, desperately, but her legs refused to move, like the world had just shattered in front of her. There was no blood spray, but something spilled from Dottie's gaze. It wasn't red. It wasn't black. It was clear, like a memory. Caleb dropped to his knees, hands clutching his thighs, fingers trembling, face pale as if he'd been shot himself. His lips moved, trying to form words. But nothing came. Alden didn't wait for an order. He surged forward, no hesitation. In seconds, he was standing between Dottie and the fallen doe. Shoulders lowered, muscles braced. A deep growl vibrated low from his throat, and his eyes scanned the tree line like twin blades. Everything about his stance screamed, "No one gets closer!" Caleb watched him, and for the first time since Alden retired, he didn't just see his dog. He saw the soldier, the guardian, not in pursuit of a target, but in protection of something sacred, in defense of another soul. Dottie didn't move. She just stretched her neck like she still believed she could catch one final breath in the air, one thread of warmth. But there was nothing, only the faint, bitter scent of gunpowder drifting through the wind. Caleb didn't know who fired the shot. No one stepped forward, not a single voice. Just the forest, and the kind of silence that felt like a scream held back by every tree. And in that moment, Caleb understood. Not every journey ends in fairness. Not every right choice is rewarded. Some losses hit like stray bullets, sudden, senseless, and cruel. But they still rip your heart open all the same. So he stayed there, sitting. Alden stood guard. Dottie is still motionless, 3 forms frozen by grief, holding on to the last warmth of a reunion that never had time to finish. Then, through the branches beyond, the sound of rustling leaves. Footsteps. A group of men emerged from the shadows, dressed in camouflage, rifles slung casually over their shoulders, voices light with laughter, faces relaxed, as if they'd just wrapped up a game. There was no remorse, no hesitation, no understanding of what they had shattered. One of the men shrugged, glanced at the fallen doe on the forest floor, and spoke like he was answering for everyone. She was alone, didn't see anyone around. Wild deer, it's legal. Caleb forced himself upright, stepping forward. His voice sliced through the air like a blade. "You killed a creature, in the middle of reuniting with her own child!" No one responded. They looked at each other. One sighed, another turned away. But not a single man apologized. Not one bowed his head. A different hunter, older, probably the leader, spoke up quickly. "We followed the local game laws. No one crossed any boundaries. If you've got a complaint, call the sheriff." Caleb trembled not from the cold, but from the kind of helpless rage that burns without a place to go. There was no one to punch, no one to scream at who'd truly understand what had just been stolen. About 20 minutes later, a local patrol car pulled up. A young officer stepped out, notebook in hand. He listened as Caleb recounted everything clearly, steadily, with pain in every word. Then the officer flipped through his notebook, jotted something down, and closed it. "I'm sorry, sir. There's no indication of a crime. They didn't leave the legal hunting zone, and deer aren't listed as protected in this region." Caleb said nothing. His eyes were bloodshot but dry now. There were no tears left to fall. No one was arrested. No one was handcuffed. No one even acknowledged what had happened. It was all wrapped up in the neat, cold language of paperwork, clean and emotionless. When Caleb returned to the clearing, Dottie was still there. Her eyes were wide open, but they no longer saw anything clearly. The wind rustled her tail, but her small, stunned body was frozen in place, like time had stopped right there with her. Alden stood guard in front of her, his posture unshaken. He didn't bark. He didn't move. But his eyes never left the tree line, scanning like he expected another threat at any moment. Caleb walked slowly toward them. Each step felt like dragging stone, but he kept moving until just a few feet away. Then he stopped and reached out, his arms gently wrapped around Dottie's neck from behind. He didn't pull. He didn't hold tight. Just enough to let her feel that someone was there, that she was not alone in this. Dottie didn't turn, didn't make a sound, but her body started to tremble, not from fear but from a silent wave crashing through her, a grief too heavy for her small frame to contain. Caleb lowered his head, resting it against her neck. He didn't speak, just kept one hand stroking the soft fur at her nape, the part that shivered like a rising tide with no shore to crash into. Some pain doesn't ask for justice. It just needs to be held without question. Caleb couldn't remember how long he stayed there, sitting against that old tree trunk. The chill of the earth eventually seeped through his worn pants. But he didn't move. Because sometimes, staying still is the only thing you can do. To say, "I'm here. I saw. And I will not let this be forgotten." The ground was cold beneath him, the kind of cold that seeped through old fabric and settled deep into the joints. Both of Caleb's knees ached sharply, but he didn't want to get up. Because Dottie hadn't left, and Alden was still standing guard, like a living monument carved in honor of grief. The forest darkened quickly. The light receded like a retreating soldier, humbled and worn. Mist slipped through every branch, curling down to the forest floor with a hush too heavy to name. Caleb leaned forward slightly and moved closer. His hand rested gently on Dottie's back, where her body still trembled with broken breaths. No one said a word, but in that stillness, a decision was made. Quietly, deeply, like a stream beneath the soil changing course, no noise, but unstoppable. The next morning, before the first rays of sun had burned through the veil of fog, Caleb stood up and shouldered his backpack. He didn't call, didn't explain. He just walked, following the same narrow trail they'd taken 3 days earlier. And behind him, Dottie moved, one step, then another. No fear, no hesitation, just choice. Quiet and clear. Alden took the center position. Every strong step from Alden was like a living bridge between two fragile hearts, one that had once lost its sense of direction and one that had lost its faith. But now they moved forward on the same path, breathing in rhythm, needing no commands. The forest didn't speak. Only dry leaves crunched beneath their feet, and the soft wind moved through pine branches, whispering a farewell that didn't need words. And yet, that sound confirmed something. This journey wasn't over. It had simply turned another page. Midway up a sloping hill, Caleb paused. He turned. Dottie was moving just behind, light on her feet, and Alden had just stepped through a beam of scattered sunlight spilling through the trees. For one short second, Caleb saw something like every scar in their hearts was finding its way home. He stood there with his hands braced on his knees, exhaling slowly, not from exhaustion, but because something deep inside was guiding him again, something beyond reason, something he hadn't trusted in years, his own instinct to believe, that a new beginning was still possible. No one belongs anywhere forever, he thought. But some places, you get to choose again. Dottie stretched her neck slightly, sniffing the breeze. Alden looked over. He didn't bark, didn't move, just waited. It was the kind of wait that didn't demand anything, the kind that simply made space for the smaller one to come forward without fear. And so the three of them kept walking. Each footprint pressed into the earth wrote a new memory beneath it. No one spoke, but somehow they all knew. On this path home, no one was walking alone anymore. By the time they stepped into the old clearing, dusk had already settled in. The wood planks on the front porch had warped slightly from damp weather, but they were familiar. So familiar that Caleb didn't need a porch light to know exactly where to step. He took off his boots, hung his flannel coat on the hook near the door, and went inside. The living room still held a faint chill from the days it had been empty. Caleb crouched down and lit the fire. Dry twigs crackled, and warm yellow light spilled into the corners of the house. Alden lay down beside the rug, calm and steady. His silhouette flickered in the glow, and just behind him, Dottie followed. Slowly, but this time, without fear. Caleb took an old wool blanket, folded it neatly, and placed it by the fireplace. It was meant for Dottie, a quiet offering, a welcome. But Dottie didn't curl into it. Instead, she shifted her small body and gently leaned into Alden's side without asking, without hesitation. Just a quiet, trusting motion that said more than words ever could. Alden didn't move, didn't even glance back. He simply lowered his muzzle, slow and steady, and rested his chin on Dottie's back. A silent promise. A dog's way of saying, "You're safe now, you don't have to carry it alone." Caleb stood for a moment, watching. He didn't speak, didn't move. Then, slowly, he pulled a wooden chair toward the window and sat down. Outside, darkness had settled in fully. But it wasn't cruel. It wasn't heavy. Just a soft black drape, dotted here and there with stars, resting quietly across the ridge. Night wind whispered through the cracks in the old wooden walls. Not cold, just empty. The kind of empty that had filled this house for years, but now, slowly, was being replaced. Not with noise, but with breath, with warmth, with presence, the kind of presence you don't have to name to feel. Caleb leaned his head back and let his eyes rest on the two shapes near the fire. One large, one small, one who had once saved lives, one who had once been saved, now lying together like the world had never been cruel, like it had always known how to hold broken things. He didn't need a radio, didn't need a book, just that chair, that fire. That sound is the soft, even rhythm of their breathing. Each breath, each rise and fall of Dottie's back, each subtle twitch of Alden's legs as he drifted between sleep and watchfulness, was like a lullaby you didn't know your heart needed. By the fire, the flames danced shadows onto the walls. Dottie's shadow curved in a soft arc, Alden's cast wide and still, like a blanket over hers. Together they made a single silhouette, quiet but unshakable. Caleb pressed his palm over his chest, right above his heart. It was still beating slowly but steadily, not like it had when he first brought Dottie home, knotted and restless. Not like the day he buried his wife beneath the pine. Just calm down now, steady, warm, just his. And in that windless night, there were no prayers, no sobs, no whispered confessions. Only peace. Peace is built from trust, from loyalty, and from the quiet, fragile courage it takes to love again even when you've been hurt before. The betrayal that is shrouded in silence, mistrust, and being treated as though you are guilty when you have done nothing wrong can sometimes be more devastating than the one that is supported by evidence. Never once did Caleb ask Dottie to stay. Alden never made an effort to stop her. They just came up every day with patience, presence, and love that did not need an explanation. And it was sufficient. If someone has ever placed blame on you without cause, if someone has ever harmed you without giving you an opportunity to speak, or if the scars of mistrust are still there, let this tale serve as a gentle reminder that not everything that is broken has to be thrown away. By simply being there, certain ties can be gradually and quietly restored. Each day. Additionally, please take your time if you are now experiencing that storm. Take a breath. Preserve what is important. Talk when it is safe to do so. Even if no one believes it yet, write down the truth. Be in the company of people who adore you without asking why, particularly if you have children or even a devoted dog who is observing and monitoring how the outside world treats you. We would like to hear from you now. Have you ever faced unjust accusations? Or supported someone while everyone else left? Tell us by leaving a comment below. Your narrative is important, perhaps more than you realize, because often the first step toward healing is simply realizing that you are not alone.